Hey, what's up? It's Cute What If this side. Today we will be seeing what if Deku discovers a new quirk but keep it secret. Now before we move ahead with the fic, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. Bam! Izuku slammed the door to the dorm room shut and braced against it with his back. He panted heavily for air but quickly pinched his nose and held his breath as he heard footsteps charging down the hallway, both to keep quiet and so he wouldn't smell them as they passed by. The footsteps grew louder but then quieter as whoever it was charged past his door in pursuit of him. Izuku waited as long as he could before breathing again, his face turning a little blue, before finally gasping for breath. Damn it, of all the quirks I could have been born with, why this one? Izuku lamented with a sigh, as he looked down to his hand and saw a thin sheen of some kind of substance. Not enough to look or feel wet, in fact one wouldn't notice unless they were extremely observant or knew what to look for. Yes, Izuku had a quirk. One that he was born with but wouldn't activate until after he turned 18. A quirk that they had kept secret from him. It stung to know what his doctors did, but he could understand given his quirk's nature, or at least what he could learn of it before being forced to run. But it didn't make it hurt any less, or save him from the situation he was in now, due to being unprepared. One might be asking how this all started and how Izuku discovered his quirk. Well, for that, we need to go back a little bit. Earlier today, during combat practice, Izuku and the rest of the class were fighting the teachers, and he just so happened to be with most of the girls from 1A, and was fighting against Midnight and Cementos. The concept was simple. Navigate the sifting cement maze while avoiding Midnight's pheromone quirk. The test in and of itself wouldn't have been an issue, they even made it a pretty decent way through, with only a few getting knocked out, before Izuku himself got a whiff of her pink gas. Not enough to pass out, but enough to get drowsy. Or at least that's what he had thought, unaware of the changes to his own biology that made him now immune to the knockout aspect of her quirk. Years of minute exposure over the course of his stay at UA had triggered his own quirk to awaken a little sooner than expected, and now Izuku was beginning to feel hot. What is this? Izuku asked as he held his nose. What's this smell? He muttered as, even with his nose pinched, he still got a hint of Midnight's gas. It was like his sense of smell was heightened in some way and his head was staring to swim as he got sweaty. Deku, a familiar voice called out, and suddenly he found himself being tackled out of the smoke by a flying, white and pink meteor. Uraraka? Izuku asked with surprise as she tried to save him from Midnight's quirk, and he blushed deeply at how they landed, with her practically straddling him and her B-cup sandwiching his face, the skin-tight suit leaving nothing to the imagination. Uraraka pushed herself up, letting Izuku breath as she looked around for any threats, then looked down to him and froze. At the time, Izuku had been very confused. He would learn later that her bare hand had brushed the exposed skin on his face, letting the pheromones in his sweat get on her, which was why she was breathing really hard now. Then Izuku's new enhanced sense of smell kicked in and he got a whiff of something off Uraraka. Something wonderful. It was the most intoxicating aroma he'd ever smelled and he found his own breath quicken. Too caught up in the moment to notice Might Jr. in his pants, trying to pitch a tent and failing due to his suit. Before anything else could happen though, the cement walls suddenly shifted and pillars shot out with the intent of hitting them. Izuku acted instantly and instinctively, activating One for All and picking up Uraraka and kicking the pillars to bits. That was his fist mistake in the moment when his nightmare in heaven truly began. In that moment, there was an explosion of mist from his body, not unlike Midnight's quirk. The cloud enveloped the entire school in seconds, triggering a biohazard alarm due to there being no quirk like this registered at the school, and everything locked down. Only a few were aware of this though, as the mist and pheromones took effect instantly. Izuku was stunned by what happened and tried to wave the mist away as he held Uraraka, though it only settled in knee height, creating a constant fog that refused to go away. What was that? He muttered to himself but froze up again as he smelt that wonderful fragrance again. He quickly recognized that it was clouding his mind though and pinched his nose. Uraraka, something wrong. Izuku was cut off by a pair of soft lips smashing into his and his brain stalled. His arms going slack and letting the girl in his arms fall to the ground, which also broke the lip contact. Izuku just stood there for a moment, staring at nothing with blank eyes. Deku. Uraraka moaned out from the ground and the greenet blinked back to reality, only to look down and see his friend in secret crush splayed out on the ground and looking up at him with hunger in her eyes and drool in the corner of her mouth. Her chest heaving with heavy breaths as her face burned atomic red. Take me, she suddenly exclaimed to him while grabbing her left breast in her hand and working it while trying to pull her pants off, to little success. Izuku just stared for a few seconds as his friend continued to pant and beg for him. His own face then turned just as red as hers and a jet of shot out of his nose, forcing his fingers away from it. Uraraka, whoa, Izuku stuttered but had to dodge as she lunged for him and he quickly pinched his nose again before his mind could get too foggy. What's happening? Did some villain use his quirk on the school? Izuku thought as he slowly backed away from his friend, who was now crawling towards him. Please Deku, please take me now, she begged him as she tried to pull her costume down to reveal any kind of skin to him, only to curse her suit's designers, who made it with avoiding wardrobe malfunctions in mind. Izuku desperately wanted to help his friend. He wanted to do anything to snap her out of it. But when faced with the sight before him, he did the only sensible thing he could think of in the moment. He activated full cowl and ran. Deku Uraraka wailed in desperation as he ran as fast as he could, bouncing off the walls of the maze. Gotta find help, Izuku repeated in his mind like a mantra to help ignore all the smells he kept passing by that seemed to mess with his head. It was then that he spotted one of his classmates. Momo, he called out with joy, too relieved to notice anything else as he landed behind her. Momo, I'm so glad I found you. Something's wrong with Uraraka, and Izuku trailed off as he finally noticed Shoto laying on the ground unconscious. Momo suddenly spoke before Izuku could question anything, and she did so with a tone that sent a jolt of electricity up his spine as he had to pinch his nose again. Momo then slowly turned to look at him over her shoulder with the same desire-filled gaze his beast friend had. Ravish Momo started as she turned and gripped her easily removed costume with the intent of peeling it off and exposing her incredible assets to Izuku. The green-clad hero was quicker though, and yelled in fear as he used Black Whip to ensnare her, making sure to wrap the black misty tentacles around her so she couldn't pull anything off. He was about to restrain her properly when another voice filled him with dread. "Uo, kinky." Izuku gasped and slowly turned his head to see Mina standing behind him, bent over with a finger pulling down her suit enough to show off her pink cleavage, and was about to show more. "I can't wait to try it out and show you some of my own," she said with a sultry voice as she accentuated all of her curves and pulled her suit down further, only for Izuku to trap her the same way he did Momo. An action he regretted as Mina moaned slightly in pleasure at being bound so tightly, causing Izuku to cringe, especially when he realized he'd let go of his nose and was being assaulted by so many enticing smells that seemed to arouse him. Cairo. Izuku's stomach took a swan dive and his face filled with dread as he heard the frog-like croak and looked up to see Tsuyu sticking to the wall above him, his amphibious friend licking her lips as she stared him down with that same deadpan expression as always. Izuku gulped with fear. They had him surrounded. Or at least that's what they thought, as even Momo looked both triumphant and expectant while still bound. All three were disappointed and calling out to him as he dropped the two girls and punched down the wall Tsuyu wasn't hanging from, and kept going, breaking down wall after wall every time he saw one of his female classmates, until finally he jumped up out of the maze. Gotta find a teacher, he thought as he kicked the air, sending him flying over and out of the maze, where he landed in front of Midnight and a knocked-out Cementos. Sensei, something wrong with Izuku started but froze up again as he realized something. So the big man finally made it out, and came right to me. "You definitely know what you want," Midnight said with a flirty tone as she snapped her whip and began pulling open her suit in a slow and sensual fashion, ready and willing to get down and dirty with the student. "Nope," was all Izuku responded with, before releasing a smokescreen and running as fast as he could, knowing he wouldn't be able to handle a pro as well as his classmates. Gotta find a male teacher who's not knocked out, Izuku thought in a panic as he saw that all the males on school grounds, save for himself, were all unconscious, and every girl seemed to be hunting for him. "Oh, what do I do, Izuku thought as he continued to run. It was all he could do with a mob of superpowered and thirsty heroines in training and veteran pros hunting for him, while everyone else was out cold. His greatest fear so far was running into Toru. After all, it would be hard to dodge a naked and horny, invisible girl. "The school's locked down so I can't get out or let anyone in to help. I can't hide, there are too many here with sensory quirks and I don't want to risk hurting them in a fight. There are too many to restrain. Why is this happening though, and why am I the only guy not affected? Is it an attack?" Mutter. Izuku droned on as he ran. He was so out of it, he didn't notice until it was too late. That Eraserhead's captured weapon was suddenly thrown out into the hall, tangling him up and pulling him into one of the rooms, where the door slammed shut and locked, with the blast door falling over it. "Ah no, please, I'm not ready," Izuku screamed as he struggled to break free but didn't want to risk hurting anyone by using full power. Whack! Izuku was cut off by something hitting him over the head. "We're not trying to screw your brains out, idiot. Now stop using your quirk, or this situation will only get worse." An old, feminine voice berated him, and Izuku's eyes snapped open in surprise as he looked up to see he was in the nurse's office with Recovery Girl and Principal Nezu both standing in front of him, unaffected by whatever quirk this was. Izuku was so relieved that he started crying in typical Midoriya fashion, and he finally relaxed and slumped forwards. One for all deactivating as he finally felt somewhat safe and the carbon fiber scarf fell loose around him. "Finally, thank goodness you two weren't affected, but wait, why weren't you affected, and for that matter why wasn't I? Who could be behind this? Could it be mutter? Whack! Oh," Izuku moaned as Recovery Girl hit him over the head again. "Brat, we don't have time for this, we need to get your quirk under control," the aging heroine yelled. Izuku blinked in confusion though, as he rubbed his head. "My quirk, what does One for All have to do with this?" he asked, but then a look of horror dawned on his face. "This isn't one of the quirks in One for All I haven't discovered yet, is it? Is this all my fault?" Nezu then stepped forward without his usual smile. "I'm sorry to say this, Mr. Midoriya, but this is indeed your doing," he said with sympathy as he looked down at the boy, who fell forwards on his hands and knees with distress. "I did this, I made my friends." He trailed off in disgust with himself and felt the urge to vomit. "It's all right, Mr. Midoriya. This isn't your fault. If anything, you should blame the doctors who diagnosed you as quirkless," Nezu said with his usual cheer returning a little. Izuku's head snapped up at the principal at that. What do you mean by? Izuku was cut off by a folder being tossed to the floor in front of him, by a fuming recovery girl. When we get out of here, I'm going to wring those sorry excuses for doctors' necks out, then I'm going to heal them so I can do it all over again, she ranted before waking over to a gurney with a knocked-out eraser head laying on it. Izuku blinked at the elderly woman before looking down and picking up the folder. Waiter saying that Izuku bagan, but didn't dare finish. You were born with a quirk, Midoriya, Nezu answered softly. Izuku's hand started to shake as a million emotions ran through him. Shock, relief, uncertainty, confusion, denial, betrayal. WWY, he stuttered out as he looked at the folder that he now realized was a medical file. Recently mailed to UA. If the torn remains of a post stamp were any indication. Why would they lie? Did Mom know? And if she did, why would she keep it from me? Izuku thought with distress. Nezu shook his head with a sigh. Believe me, Recovery Girl and I are both disgusted by their decision to withhold this information from you the way they did, especially given the recent consequences of you and the staff being uninformed and unprepared. However, their reasoning was not without merit given your quirk's unusual nature, Nezu explained, though he seemed oddly uncomfortable with the last part. The change was notable enough to catch Izuku's attention, and he snapped out of his funk enough to open the folder and start reading, only for his eyes to then widen and his face to turn scarlet as exploded out his nose. Izuku quickly closed the folder and held it away, both to protect it from the spray and so he wouldn't have to look at it, the folder somehow feeling unclean to his hands. Please tell me this is a cruel joke, Izuku practically begged as he looked to Nezu. Unfortunately, the bipedal rodent hybrid just shook his head. I'm afraid it's not, Mr. Midoriya. Though the data available on your quirk is largely incomplete due to the only evaluation being your initial checkup with the specialist. Recent events confirm what little is recorded, Nezu explained with sympathy. Your quirk is geared entirely towards reproduction. The mist you unknowingly released is a pheromone cloud, similar to Midnight's quirk, except causing arousal towards you specifically in females and rendering only males unconscious, Nezu explained, much to Izuku's growing embarrassment and mortification. Even now though, he couldn't help his curiosity and habitual need to analyze every quirk he came across. Why knock out the males though? And why are you and Recovery Girl unaffected? He asked with an awkward blush. Elimination of competition, Nezu replied instantly and with a little excitement at being able to analyze and speculate about Izuku's quirk. He did feel a little guilty at deriving some form of entertainment from the situation at hand, but he couldn't help it. His darker and traumatized side demanded stimulation, and if it could help the situation in some way, he would allow it. By incapacitating rival males, you increase your own chances of mating and producing offspring. And since Recovery Girl is too old and I'm not human, we weren't recognized as targets. Nezu continued but had to pause as Izuku shrieked in horror and smoke erupted from his head, as his spirit attempted to escape through his gaping mouth. Nezu simply smiled as he waited for Izuku to come back to his senses and for his resident nurse to stop glaring at him. It took all of Izuku's willpower not to pass out then and there. He was already in danger of becoming anemic from all the nosebleeds. Izuku shook his head clear as he tried to organize his thoughts. Why didn't anyone tell me about this sooner? Now I've unintentionally drugged my friends and everyone at school, he yelled out in exasperation. Yes, that was a terrible decision on their part, but not one without reason. The first and obvious one being that you were only 4 when you were diagnosed. The other reason is tied to another theorized aspect of your quirk, Nezu continued and gained Izuku's undivided attention again. Another theorized aspect of your quirk is that you not only increase the chance of conception, but can also control what quirks your progeny receives, Nezu explained. Izuku just stared at Nezu for a moment after that, then proceeded to pinch himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming, and gave a disappointed sigh at the very real pain he received. Okay, that is a pretty insane ability, but why would that make them keep quiet about it? He asked. For your own protection. You know already the potential danger of people knowing about a quirk that can be passed on to others. How do you think people and organizations would react if they knew they could control what quirks people were born with? Why, if the wrong people got a hold of you and you really could do it, then they would have an army of extremely powerful soldiers, indoctrinated and trained from birth, Nezu explained with seriousness. Izuku felt a lead ball drop in his stomach at that. He did know how bad that would be, especially if someone like All For One found out. If that happened, Izuku and some poor girls would basically be turned into breeding stock, forced to cultivate powerful quirks for the worst villain to ever exist. A thought that sent ice running through his veins. Nezu nodded as he saw the realization sink in on Izuku's face. Exactly, and while I don't agree with how they went about it, whoever mixed up your medical records clearly knew what would happen if the wrong people found out, and probably saved your life by doing so. At the very least, they were obviously planning to let you know after you turned 18, but your quirk awakened before we could relay the information to you or prepare for anything, Nezu explained. Izuku groaned as he pulled at his hair. Oh, this is all too much. Why couldn't we have figured out about this sooner? And why is it so powerful? I don't understand how so many pros could be knocked out so easily. He vented his frustrations and confusion. You're forgetting an important detail, brat, Recovery Girl called out. You have another quirk that stockpiles power, she continued, and Izuku's eyes shot wide. One for all, he spoke in horror as he realized why his quirk was so effective, with one for all amplifying its power beyond what they may have originally thought. And he had been using full cal at a high percentage while running all over the school. If it really did amplify his original quirk, then just how bad were things? Nezu gave a firm nod in agreement, as if he could read Izuku's mind. Indeed, and I fear for the students and faculty's mental conditions because of it. There's no telling how exposure to such powerful stimulants could affect them over a prolonged period of time. The only solace we can take at the moment is that this event is contained to the school grounds, but we can't risk breaking quarantine, Nezu spoke as he turned to Recovery Girl. On that note, any progress on countering the effects, he asked, and Izuku turned to the medical hero, who was now approaching him with a swab and syringe. Izuku didn't ask questions. He understood what she needed from him and held out his arm, after removing his gauntlet, and rolling up the sleeve so she could swab off a sample of his pheromone-infused sweat, and draw. It will depend on what I can get from these samples. We may have to go to the support department to run proper tests, she explained as she took her samples, then kissed Izuku on the forehead to heal him. She quickly leveled a glare at him though. This won't mean anything though if you can't get this under control. For now, focus on shutting off your quirk while I focus on these samples, she ordered, and Izuku went ramrod straight at the order. Yes ma'am, he replied as an image of Gran Torino took her place momentarily. He may not have the same trauma as All Might, but the old hero still left his mark on Izuku. Izuku quickly brushed that aside though as he clenched his fist and looked down at it. Now was the time to work. He would spend what time he could focusing on gaining control of this power. He would, bang, whip his head to the door as it dented in. Oh dear, Nezu spoke as more banging and explosions were heard. It's useless hiding, Loverboy, me and ears made a pact, so we know you're in there. A loud voice was heard through the door, likely due to a vocal quirk or a megaphone. Nezu quickly moved to a nearby shelf and hit a hidden button, opening up a secret exit. Go, we can't work on an antidote while dealing with them too. You need to lead them away and keep them busy, Nezu instructed. Yes sir, Izuku responded, and he ran to the exit and activated full cal, but paused and looked down at himself. The last thing he needed was to spread the effects of his quirk more, but he wouldn't stand a chance if he didn't use one for all. Izuku grimaced. He would just have to hope for the best. He did pull back on the power though, in the hopes that it wouldn't supercharge his quirk too much, and then bolted out the exit and resumed his evasion through the school, shutting off one for all when he could and trying to get his quirk under control, which is what led to Izuku's current situation. He had led the girls of Yue on a merry chase, but unfortunately, it appeared some had begun coordinating with each other out of desperation. As such, those that were exhausted from the chase had time to recover, while those with sensory quirks tried to find his hiding places. Fortunately, Izuku managed to incapacitate and restrain a few of them, if only temporarily, while leading them to the other side of the school. The real pain was avoiding the pros, who he didn't dare confront directly. Fortune once again smiled on him though, as they were all too honey to think clearly, and he was able to dupe them into searching the wrong area. Now the exhausted Izuku let himself fall to the floor to catch his breath. Izuku pulled at the collar of his suit as the heat got to him. He was drenched in sweat and he couldn't tell if it was from his quirk or the workout of running nonstop for what had to be hours now. Ugh, I need to get this under control, or else it's never going to stop, Izuku bemoaned quietly as he tried once again to turn off his quirk or at least restrain it. He found no success though. Izuku sighed and looked around the room. Apparently he had run into Uraraka's room, something that made him blush slightly as his innocent mind thought of the scandal. Then his face burned even brighter as he remembered how the girl was when he last saw her, his mind going into less innocent territory as he thought of how her body had felt through the suit. Izuku quickly slapped his cheeks to bring himself back to reality, and out of the gutter. He'd already had enough near encounters today to last a lifetime. He was honestly amazed, and slightly impressed with himself, that he'd prevented any of the girls from exposing themselves to him so far. Though that probably wouldn't last much longer as the girls got more desperate. Especially if the one random girl yelling out that she'd start dressing like Toru if he didn't come out was serious. Izuku took a breath before standing back up and shaking out his sore muscles. He then decided to try and find something to dry the sweat off with. It was getting uncomfortable after all, and he was already spreading his pheromones enough as is, without being drenched in them. He tried flipping on the lights but nothing happened, and he looked up to see a broken light bulb. Izuku gave suspicions hum, but brushed it off as he refocused on ground level, missing the shadow moving in the corner of the ceiling. Miraculously, he found a dry towel hanging on the door to her closet, probably left behind after a trip to the showers and dried on its own while hanging there. Or at least that's the logical conclusion Izuku's mind reached. Had he not been so tired and scatterbrained due to everything that was happening, he might have noticed that the towel was a little too pristine to have been used. Izuku did arch an eyebrow as he sniffed the air. Perfume I didn't think Uraraka used, that he pondered aloud as he reached for the bait, unaware of the hunter stalking him from the shadows above. Izuku grabbed the towel and dried off his face, but grimaced as he felt the sweat beneath his suit. He hesitated for a moment before taking his top off and setting it over a chair, where he then proceeded to try and dry off some more. Izuku froze though, as he suddenly felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a hungry wolf. He then felt hot and moist air against the nape of his neck, making his hairs stand on end. Then he smelled it. Hidden beneath the perfume was that wonderful, amazing smell from before, and it made Izuku's eyes shot wide in fear as his arousal suddenly spiked from the close proximity to its source. "Got you, Deku," Uraraka whispered behind him, and Izuku paled as he realized he walked right into her trap. "Shit," was all he managed to say, before a pair of arms and legs suddenly wrapped around him and put him into a headlock. The pads of her fingers pressing down on him and taking away gravity, making him float up in her grasp. Izuku was too shocked and tired to react fast enough, so even as he activated full cowl, he didn't use it. "You can't break free, Deku, you'd have to use too much of your quirk, and I know you would never hurt me," Uraraka said with a combination of pride and that battle madness she had developed following her defeat in the sports festival, and her internship with Gunhead. Izuku gulped in fear as he realized she was right, as they floated there in the middle of the room with nothing for him to grab for leverage. He could have used his quirk to make a blast of air pressure, but that might hurt his friend, whose toned muscles he could feel tensing under her smooth skin. Izuku's mind went blank for a moment as he realized Uraraka wasn't wearing her suit. She might have still been wearing her bra and panties, but other than that, she was all skin. Izuku then heard Uraraka chuckling darkly. "I finally got you," she said, mostly to herself as she capitalized on his moment of hesitation to contort around him and buried his face in her ample cleavage while still holding him in such a way that he couldn't break free. Uraraka moaned as she felt Izuku's surprised and panicked shrieks reverberate between her, and one of his hands broke free just enough to try and push her away, but instead ended up grabbing her left breast, and he couldn't stop himself from squeezing it through her bra. "Can you smell me, Deku? I know you have some kind of enhanced sense of smell from watching you avoiding everyone, and that it affects you," Uraraka moaned out as she continued to hold him close and was satisfied to feel him struggling less and less, but didn't dare let her guard down. She would much rather be kissing him right now, but she couldn't risk letting him run away again. "Ooh, this was definitely worth floating above the school for so long. Waiting for you to get tired and stop," she continued as she felt the valley between her getting hot and wet from Izuku's panicked and aroused breathing. She then looking down at his red and steaming face and noticed his eyes getting cloudier the longer he was forced to breathe in her scent. And it was working terrifyingly well, as Izuku felt his resolve crumble as his arousal grew, and he couldn't stop his hand from squeezing her breast, as impure thoughts and desires filled his head. A small part of him couldn't help but wonder what the deal was with his sense of smell, and what purpose it even served. But such thoughts were left by the wayside as his lower brain took the wheel. "Oh," Uraraka moaned as she felt Izuku's erection finally win its battle against his suit's pants and rub against her through the layers of clothes, and she began grinding against him. Izuku moaned into her chest as his eyes rolled up in his head and became half-lidded. Seeing this and knowing she couldn't take much more waiting, Uraraka finally let go of Izuku's now limp body, sans the hand on her, and kissed him deeply. Izuku's eyes shot wide and back into focus as his secret crush smashed her lips into his and forced her tongue into his mouth. Izuku made muffled sounds as he was stunned by his second kiss ever, Achako having claimed the first earlier today when this all started. Eventually he realized his arms were free again and grabbed her shoulders to push her away, but Uraraka clung at him tightly, wrapping her arms and legs around him. Izuku's mind was becoming more and more clouded, but he worked up the resolve to push her head away from his, breaking the lip lock and letting him breath. "Wait, Uraraka, stop, we can't." "Yes, we can," Uraraka cut him off with desperate tears falling from her eyes. "Deku, I love you," she exclaimed with her eye clenched shut. Izuku froze up as the words left her mouth, and a part of him desperately wanted to believe the girl he'd been crushing on since enrolling in UA. But he knew she was currently under the influence of his quirk, which only made him feel guilty. "No, Uraraka, you're not in your right mind. You're under the influence of a quirk, so we can't." "I don't care," Uraraka cut him off again with a desperate scream as more tears fell from her eyes. "To Izuku, I've had a crush on you ever since you saved me in the entrance exam," she began, and Izuku gasped before going silent. "I've had feelings for you for years but was too scared to do anything about it. But now I can say what I've always wanted to Izuku. I'm in love with you," she said with a seriousness that seemed to cut through the overwhelming lust she was feeling. Izuku was silent as he just stared at Uraraka in shock, and she looked away. "Please, Deku, it hurts so badly that you won't take Mito. Not if you become one with me. You have no idea how much it hurts physically and mentally," Uraraka cried, her body actually shaking with the agony his rejection had caused. Her mind finally breaking to the point that even her lust couldn't keep her moving forwards to her target. Meanwhile, Izuku could do nothing but stare at Uraraka. In spite of his quirk's influence, he could tell her confusion was genuine, and he could see the actual pain she was in. As someone who broke his bones on the regular, he knew what pain looked like. "Is this what they're all going through? Is this what I'm doing to them?" he thought with guilt, and his own tears began to spring forth at the pain he'd unintentionally inflicted upon his best friend. Uraraka's grip on him was weak now. He could easily break free and escape. But he didn't. He couldn't. He couldn't leave his best friend like this, suffering because of him. He hesitated for a moment, before placing his hand on her cheek. Uraraka froze upon feeling his callous skin on hers and looked up into his emerald eyes with hope and desperation. Izuku just gave her a soft smile as he rubbed his thumb over her cheek, his skin gently gliding across her perpetual blush and wiping away the tears. "Urara Ochako," he started softly and with nervousness. "To have had a crush on you for years too," he admitted while averting his gaze, but he clearly heard her gasp. "I guess we were both too scared to say anything," he said with a light chuckle to hide his trepidation. He then looked her in the eyes and held her gaze for a moment. Then he finally surrendered to his emotions and instincts, throwing Katayan and common sense to the wind as he leaned forward and kissed the girl of his dreams. Uraraka froze for a moment before melting into the kiss. It was slow and gentle, unlike the messy thing she had initiated, and they break away much sooner to breathe and smile softly at each other. It was a perfect moment that Izuku would forever remember. It was also a short-lived moment, as that hunger and lust from before reasserted itself in Uraraka's mind and showed on her face. She then shoved Izuku back harshly, causing him to yelp as he flew back and hit the wall. His attention was quickly captured by his crush though, as she shimmied out of her panties and then unclipped her bra, sending it flying and letting her B-cup float free. Izuku found himself paralyzed as his eyes were glued to Uraraka's exposed form. From her toned abs that could rival his own, to her thick and toned thighs. She had thick hips to match her nice thick rear, but it wasn't overly massive. And they were easily the star of the show, literally defying gravity as they floated there and drifted around, capped with decently sized and erect, brown nipples. Izuku was amazed his nose wasn't gushing, but he supposed that wouldn't be a problem now that he had surrendered to his instincts. He didn't fight or run as she floated up to him and began frantically pulling off his shoes, forcing him to grab hold of the bookshelf next to him, as his body was pulled with her, until he was practically laying down in the air. Once his shoes and socks were off, she stared on his pants, causing Izuku to become flustered as his face burned red. He just couldn't fight it anymore though. Couldn't resist the and cute girl begging to be bred by him. So instead of pinching his noses shut, he breathed deep the wonderful and arousing aroma Ochako put off and found himself nearly drooling by the time she got his pants and underwear off. Ochako ripped the last article of clothing off and tossed it away before looking up, only to freeze in fear and desire at what she saw. Holy shit, he's massive, she thought as her legs started to rub together with dread and excitement. She had nothing to compare Izuku's length and girth to. But even without a reference, she could tell he was big. She guessed about 7 or 8 inches long, give or take, and maybe about 3 inches wide. Ochako gulped as she tried to figure out how it would fit inside her, and Izuku was similarly surprised by his own endowment. Ochako's lust quickly took over though, as she grabbed his length and began jerking it back and forth, eliciting a surprised yelp and moan from Izuku. Ochako wanted to do so many things with his little Deku right now, but the effects of Izuku's quirk were too much for her to handle. She felt dreadfully empty inside to the point of pain. She had been denied for too long and needed him inside her this instant. And so, quick as a flash, Ochako climbed up Izuku and locked eyes with him as she spread her legs and impaled herself on his length. They both yelled and screamed as their eyes bugged out and they threw their heads back. Even after they both stopped yelling, they still stared above themselves with mouths open in silent screams. Then they looked to each other with wide eyes as Izuku throbbed inside Ochako and she clenched down on him tightly with her developed muscles. Then they looked down to where they were joined together. A small trickle of leaking out, but the pain had faded almost instantly. Then they locked eyes again as the reality of what they'd done sank in. They had a moment of clarity, now that Ochako had filled that emptiness that tormented her. And Izuku finally embraced his true feeling and instincts. Then something clicked inside them both. Like a switch being flipped, and Izuku pushed off the wall and gripped Ochako's hips tightly as he began thrusting into her violently. Yes, Ochako moaned with bliss as she felt Izuku empty and fill her over and over again in the span of a few seconds. Her lover grunted with satisfaction at her tightness as he rammed into her as fast and deep as he could, his tip smashing her cervix and forcing it to open slightly. Their hearts were pounding in their chests and their lounges burned for more air as they panted between moans, their minds consumed with the desire for each other. In that moment nothing else mattered. Nothing else existed, as they stared into each other's eyes and Ochako leaned in and kissed her lover passionately, their tongues doing battle as Izuku pounded Ochako with his pelvis as hard as he could. As they broke the kiss to breathe, Izuku pushed her upper body back so he could look at her and her bouncing ass, flying in every direction without gravity to pull them back. Momentum instead being the force that caused them to undulate as they were, with each thrust he gave her. Her strong legs that had been spread wide, now locked around Izuku to keep from floating away from his thrusts, so he could send his hands elsewhere, and so she could try to match his movements with her own. And then Izuku suddenly felt urged forwards. Like an instinct he couldn't understand or deny, he felt compelled to reach forwards and grip her and squeeze and fondle them, causing his lover to moan louder. Then he leaned forward and started sucking on them hard. Ochako yelled as she clenched around his erection and reached up to hold his head to her as he moved from one to the other. He sucked so hard while leaving a thin coating of saliva on each nipple and a few bite marks. It was almost like he was trying to nurse on her. And the longer they went on, the more pleasure they seemed to derive from their lovemaking. Unbeknownst to Ether, Izuku's quirk was hard at work. His manhood was leaking precum into her, which was actually doing more than just clearing the way for his climax. It acted as a stimulant, making it even more pleasurable for Ochako, and causing her cervix to open up. At the same time, Izuku's erection was actually changing size in order to perfectly fill Ochako, and hit all the right spots, and as soon as her womb was open, it grew in length, penetrating deep. Yes, smash me Deku, Ochako screamed in climax, as she felt him fully penetrate her deepest place. His precum then continued to leak into her womb where it quickly made its way into her ovaries, where it stimulated them. Ochako's eyes then widened as she felt it. A sudden burst of heat on either side of her uterus as she was forced to ovulate. It was already a dangerous day for her, and yet Izuku's quirk took no chances. Deku, I think I just ovulated, Ochako warned her lover, even if she had no intention of letting him pull out, and he paused in his thrusting and suckling for a moment, only for green electricity to then envelop him as he thrust into her with even more speed and force. HOOOLLYYYSHIIITTT, Ochako screamed with uncharacteristically crass language, at the pleasure she received from the inhuman speed and strength he hit her with, and she climaxed again, but still Izuku didn't slow down. Even as they bounced off one of the walls, Izuku didn't know what came over him, but her admittance that she was fertile and would definitely get pregnant if he climaxed now just seemed to turn him on even more. He just had to ravish her and claim her as his own. He had to breed her and plant his seed deep inside her. And yet he couldn't come yet. It would have been frustrating if not for the overwhelming pleasure. He could tell he was ready to explode at any moment, and yet his own quirk prevented it, even as Ochako screamed her way through another orgasm, and he didn't know why. He knew it would come soon though. Right now he just needed to focus on Ochako and sucking on her wonderful breast. He wasn't quite sure why that last part was so important yet, but he kept at it, even as he realized they had grown ever so slightly in the short time since he started sucking them. Her hips had also widened slightly as he ran his free hand down and gripped her firm butt. It was almost like his quirk was preparing her body to bear his children. Then his eyes widened as a whole new pleasure hit him, and it tasted amazing. Izuku moaned in pleasure and Ochako cried out as milk shot out of her, both into Izuku's mouth where he greedily drank it, and out between his fingers, from her other breast as he squeezed it, where it then floated, still under the effect of Ochako's quirk. Izuku felt a sense of accomplishment for some reason as he drank and felt pleasure and desire fully overwhelm him as he continued smashing Ochako's womb, even as she orgasmed again and moved her hands to claw at his back. Something else happens in that moment though. Time seemed to slow down for Izuku, as information suddenly filled his head and his analysis of Ochako's quirk joined it, and suddenly Izuku understood everything about it. Genetic history, what chromosomes matched with which and what new genes could be safely added to get a new result. And he needed to choose now. He needed to make 3 quirks. He didn't know how he knew that, but he did. Or he could let it be random, but there was no need for that. In that moment he had an unbelievable sense of clarity, free of lust and desire and fear. And he already knew what genes to give. He had spent his whole life analyzing quirks, and he knew his friends' quirks as well as they did. Better in fact if he counted now, so he already had the perfect combinations figured out. All of this happened in the span of a few seconds, and Izuku finally released Ochako's breast to lock eyes with her. "Oh Ochako, I'm coming," he warned her, and he could have sworn he saw hearts appear in her eyes briefly. "Do it, knock me up Deku," she begged, and Izuku kissed her before grunting and crying out, "OCHAKO, IZUKU, smash." They both screamed as Izuku thrust as deep as he could, and Ochako could feel his erection bulge as his seed run up his length, before exploding inside her, directly into her unprotected and fertile womb. Her insides clenching tightly as the biggest orgasm yet hit her, sending her body into spasms as her belly actually bloated slightly from the amount released. Izuku's body then relaxed and one for all deactivated as he hugged his lover close, both sweaty and breathing heavily as they recovered. Ochako seemed to get herself under control though, in spite of the how sore and abused her pelvis and womanhood felt, and pressed the pads of her fingers together, releasing her quirk and letting them fall to the bed below. Izuku collapsing on top of Ochako, whose jelly legs fell from their leg lock and trembled. After a moment, Izuku propped himself up and smiled at Ochako before kissing her. "I love you," he whispered to her, still high on the afterglow. The Ochako's eyes widened at the confusion, and she smiled back. "I love you too," she replied, and kissed him while caressing his freckled cheek. Izuku and Ochako stayed in the same position for a while as they recovered and stared into each other's eyes. An immense feeling of relief settling in over them at both finally confessing to each other and being accepted, and for finally relieving the tension induced by Izuku's quirk. Izuku then sat up and pulled himself out of her. Both were surprised to see he was still hard and ready for more. They also realized that his seed wasn't leaking out. Not a drop left Ochako's swollen womb. A thought that made her shiver with excitement. In the back of her mind, Ochako was torn between hoping he would dive back in and smash her brains out some more, and terrified that she wouldn't be able to keep up with him. She was already sore and exhausted from Izuku smashing her, especially after he used one for all. Her legs felt like jelly, and it felt like a bomb had gone off inside her, which wasn't an inaccurate analogy with one for all. She probably wouldn't be able to walk for a while. She wasn't upset though. She still felt a sense of fullness in spite of him no longer being joined with her. A sense of fulfillment even. The two looked to each other with love in their gazes, but they soon blinked it away as their minds cleared and their eyes both shot wide as they realized what they'd done. Izuku's face turned red as he looked at Ochako and felt the urge to cover his face and look away in shame. But he couldn't. Even with the enticing smell gone, he couldn't stop looking at the beautiful and cute girl laying naked and satisfied before him. His eyes then drifted down to her slightly swollen belly as the implications of their lovemaking set in. His hands trembled with fear and, to his shame and guilt, excitement. He knew there was no way she wasn't pregnant now, and Ochako seemed to realize this too as she looked down and placed her hand on her belly. Oh Ochako God, I'm so sorry too, couldn't control myself, I muff. Izuku was cut off by Ochako lunging up and kissing him. It was not the same lust-filled and desperate kiss from before, but a tender, loving kiss. When she broke away, she smiled gently at him while cupping his cheeks. It's okay Izuku, it wasn't your fault, she said with care and concern for him. Izuku only felt his guilt growing though. But it is my fault, it's my quirk that did this, he confessed to her and tried to pull away, but she didn't let him. Hugging him close and holding his head to her bosom. Not in a way though, but in a comforting way. As a mother would her child. You couldn't control it. It wasn't your fault. And I didn't lie when I said I love you. If I am pregnant, then I'm glad it's yours, she said softly to him as she hugged him close. Izuku was stunned for a moment but soon hugged her back as he cried softly. He then pulled away and Ochako let him as she lay back down to rest her sore body. If someone said her hip bone might have been cracked a little, she would have believed them. Izuku searched her face for any lies or the influence of his quirk but saw none. Only genuine love for him, and he smiled as he kissed her. Just a brief peck before sighting up. His eyes then fell to her belly and he hesitated. Ochako grabbed his hand though and placed it on her belly. "To think I'm actually excited," Ochako admitted, causing Izuku's gaze to snap to hers. "I'll admit that this isn't how I planned on starting a family, and it's definitely not ideal, but I can't help but feel happy about it," she confessed with an embarrassed smile, which Izuku returned. Her gaze then went to her belly. "I wonder what they're going to be," she muttered to herself. "Two girls and a boy," Izuku blurted without realizing it, and Ochako's head snapped up to his with wide eyes. Izuku blinked with surprise at his own words, before sputtering under her gaze. Sorry, it's just well my quirk lets me control what quirks my are kids. Well heavy, so I guess I also know how many there are. And what genders without even realizing it," Izuku admitted with a sheepish smile. Ochako just blinked at Izuku in shock for a moment. "Triplets, I'm going to have triplets," she said as it sank in. Izuku's words only making it all the more real. They were going to have a big family to take care of, especially if Izuku couldn't get control of his quirk in the future. Though even if he did, it might not matter. Ochako was sure, even without his quirk affecting her, she was now addicted to his little Deku and how it absolutely ruined her. Regardless, Izuku was still a little concerned about Ochako and what she thought of this, but relaxed as he felt her thumb brush over his hand on her belly and noticed the smile on her face. Izuku also noticed that she seemed completely free from the effects of his quirk. He also noticed that his quirk seemed to be under control now. It was like as soon as he stopped fighting it, his quirk stopped fighting him, and now he wasn't sweating pheromones constantly anymore. His sense of smell, while still enhanced, didn't completely overwhelm him now. Though that was probably due in part to Ochako no longer smelling like she did before he got her pregnant. Izuku's eyes widened then, as he realized something. "That's what my sense of smell is for, it lets me know if a girl can get pregnant, that's why Recovery Girl never affected me," he thought with excitement at understanding how an aspect of his quirk functioned. Duo. Izuku was broken from his thoughts as Ochako moaned softly and he felt her hand grip his a little tightly, while the other gripped the sheets. "Ochako," he asked with concern as she closed her eyes in response to the strange sensation. "It wasn't pain, but it was weird. Deku, something feels strange," she said. Her eyes then shot wide and she gasped as her gaze snapped to her belly. Izuku soon shared the same reaction, as he felt her abs disappear beneath his fingers. Her skin grew tight and rose up, and they both watched as her belly grew before their very eyes, expanding quickly until her pregnancy was at full term. After only a few seconds, Izuku and Ochako's mouths fell open as they stared in shock at her very heavily pregnant belly. It distended out further than normal due to how many she was carrying. Neither Ochako nor Izuku knowing what to do or how to react. Ochako's mind just went blank from the shock. Izuku on the other hand wished his was, as several emotions clashed in him. Fear and disbelief first and foremost, but also excitement and, to his shame, arousal. The proof of his conquest and virility set off an instinctual release of dopamine in his brain, and it took every bit of his willpower not to jump on his lover and ravish her again, and he hated himself for it. However, whatever Ether felt in that moment was instantly washed away when they felt a strong kick from inside Ochako's swollen belly. And suddenly their minds were clear. No fear, no lust. As Izuku moved his hand slightly to feel the tiny, foot-shaped bump on Ochako's belly with his fingers, and she did the same, they both couldn't stop the impossibly wide smiles and laughter that erupted from them both. They shed tears of joy as they felt another kick. their hearts feeling lighter as amazement and wonder took hold. The two then locked eyes and saw their own feelings reflected in the other. The next thing either knew, they were kissing again. They pulled away to gaze into each other's eyes, but as the euphoria wore off, Achako's expression became more concerned. Deku, Quirk isn't going to make me give birth in like the next few seconds, is it? She asked with nervousness as she felt her belly and thought on how quickly it had grown. Izuku's own eyes widened in realization and concern, and his gaze shifted back down. And suddenly all of his worries and anxiety came rushing back as his mind scrambled to try and analyze the situation. I don't know, do you feel like you're about to give birth? Izuku asked with trepidation. The reality that he was about to become a father now looming over him by a hair's breadth. Achako stared down at her belly for a moment before shaking her head in frustration. I don't know, I've never been pregnant before, heck I was until a few minutes ago, she replied as panic began to set in. What are we going to do if they do come soon, she asked with fear, though as she held her belly protectively, Izuku could tell it was for their children more than herself. Izuku felt the panic start to set in too, as he remembered they were still trapped in UA with a large number of horny girls that all wanted a piece of him. Izuku's eyes then became transfixed on Achako and her pregnant belly again, as another instinct awakened within him. One not connected to his quirk, and he clenched his fists. It's everything's going to be alright, he spoke softly to Achako as he hugged her and forced his mind to calm down. He couldn't afford to panic now. He was going to be a father after all, so he needed to step up and protect them. He was relieved when Achako sighed and relaxed in this embrace. I'll take you to the nurse's office. Recovery girl will be able to help, he assured her, though he was internally dreading having to explain this to the grouchy old hero. Something that Achako shared, but both were willing to set their feelings aside for their children. Boom! What the two lovers jumped at the explosion from outside, and Izuku quickly moved to the window to look outside, only to go pale at what he saw. What is it? Achako asked as she turned to sit on the edge of the bed, her hand still resting on her belly. The hysterical laughter that briefly escaped Izuku wasn't a comforting sign. It's Jirosh must have heard us, and now her and Hatsum have a giant match trying to punch down the dormitory's gates, Izuku explained with a hollow voice and twitching eye. You might be asking why the match. Well, Nezu has been upgrading the school's security system constantly ever since the first break-in, so there are actually heavy-duty security gates that pop up all over the school in the event of an emergency, which was one of the reasons why Izuku managed to avoid the girls so well, since Nezu told him over the power to get a keycard and destroy the rest. Now Gyro and her partner in crime were slowly but surely busting down the gates, keeping them out and possibly drawing the attention of other girls in the area while they were at it. It would seem that Hatsum had prepared for that though, as she had an army of robots guarding them to make sure they'd get Midoriya all to themselves, and probably to keep him from escaping. Oh, this is bad. We gotta get out of here, he called back to Achako, who looked thoughtful. You should just go ahead without me, she said as she looked down at her belly and completely missing Izuku freezing in place. What, he asked, though his voice was a little hollow sounding. They're not after me and I'll just slow you down. You could run while I make my way. Achako was cut off by Izuku grabbing her shoulders and making her look up into his hard and determined eyes. Achako, I'll only say this once, I am not leaving you and the babies here alone, he spoke with no room for argument. Achako couldn't help the stunned expression on her face as she saw a side to Izuku he rarely showed. The buts. No buts. What would you do if your water broke while I'm out running all over the school, which has whole blocks of cities built in it for mock battles? How do you think I would feel if something went wrong and I wasn't there to help? Izuku spoke with finality. Achako was quiet for a moment as she was caught between sad that she was holding Izuku back and happy that he cared so much. But then how do we get out of here? I saw Nezu and Recovery Girl leave the nurse's office and head for the support department, so we have a long way to go, and well, after Yao smashed me so hard I don't think I can run even if I wasn't pregnant with triplets, Achako admitted with a blush. Izuku couldn't help but blush deeply in kind, though he did feel some pride at her admission that he satisfied her so thoroughly. I'll just carry you then, he said with determination to help hide his blush. While all the girls on campus are chasing us, you can definitely take my weight, but not without having to use your quirk to get away from them all. And what if that level of speed hurt the babies, she said, and Izuku's head fell in defeat as he listened to the girls outside still blasting away at the door. Oh, if only there was a way I could lead them away and get back to you quickly without Gyro hearing me, Izuku lamented, and he didn't even want to think about carrying a heavily pregnant Achako through that horde of Hatsum's death bots. Izuku felt his frustrations growing and he gripped his head, unaware of the slight detail they'd missed while trying to figure out a solution to their problems. Deku, Achako trailed off with a stutter as she watched him. There must be some way. But the dorms are boxed in by high walls during an emergency, Izuku continued as he began to mutter. Deku, maybe if I try going over the walls and lead them away, but that's so high to jump they may not see me and I need to be able to get back quickly. Deku, Achako yelled, finally breaking Izuku from his trance. What, he asked innocently, only to then blink as he looked down at Achako, a few feet below him. He blinked a few times before realizing he was floating. What, Izuku yelped as he flailed his arms around but couldn't get balanced right. What is this? It doesn't feel like when I use float, Izuku thought as he started to spin. This effect did feel familiar though. Deku, you fingertips, Ochako called out, and he looked at his hands and was surprised to see pink pads on the ends, just like. Izuku gasped and looked at Ochako, before back to his hands and pressed his fingers together. He then felt gravity reassert itself on him and he fell to the ground with a thud. Oh, Izuku moaned as he pushed himself back up, but yelped as the shirt he touched on the floor started to float away, and he felt a light tug on his stomach. Deku, Ochako called out as she stood up on shaky-legged and wobbled a little due to both her smashed pelvis and the added weight on her front. Izuku quickly stood up before she could try and bend down and looked at her before looking to his fingers again. How he muttered before looking up at the shirt floating in the air, then to his pregnant lover standing in front of him, also looking at the shirt. Ochako then grabbed the top of Izuku's suit from where he hung it on her desk chair and used her quirk on it, the suit floating up before she released it and it landed back in her hands, but the shirt Izuku touched didn't stop floating. Izuku watched all this and then looked to his fingers before hesitantly pressing them together like Ochako, and lo and behold, the shirt fell to the ground. "You copied your quirk somehow," he muttered in shock, his brain struggling to understand how this was possible. He was distracted by a slapping sound though, and looked over the Ochako rubbing her forehead while groaning in confusion and frustration. "So you can sleep with girls and get their quirks. I'm now really glad you're such an oblivious and innocent cinnamon roll." "Well, not so innocent now. But still, how does that even work anyway?" Ochako said with exasperation. Izuku just looked down at his fingers again as he tried to process everything. "I don't know," he said as he tried to piece everything together. His eyes shot wide soon after though, as realization struck him. "Wait, I think actually do know how this is possible," Beautifit as he trailed off as he looked at his hands. "What are you?" Ochako was interrupted by a tiny black and purple vortex coming to life between Izuku's fingers. A small singularity that weakly drew in everything around it, even light. The pull was weak, but Izuku couldn't help the grin that spread across his face, until his cheeks puffed out and he deactivated the quirk as he ran to Ochako's trash can and puked his guts up. Rainbows glowing out of the can. "Ugh, so that's what it's like overusing your quirk." "Well, sort of," he moaned as he sat up and wiped his mouth. He soon felt Ochako's eyes boring into his head though, and turned to see her confused and exasperated stare. "Okay, what was that?" "Was that my quirk?" she asked while holding her finger up as if to replicate what Izuku did. Izuku just gave a sheepish smile as he grabbed some tissue to wipe the rainbow vomit away. "No, it's one of the quirks I gave our kids," Izuku explained, and Ochako's gaze locked with his before falling to her belly. "That's one of their quirks," she said with amazement, and Izuku smiled at the wonder he saw on her face. He then looked down at his hands though and thought. This didn't prove anything, but it supported his theory. Either an aspect of his quirk, or the stockpiling feature of One for All, had somehow saved the genetic information he'd gotten from Ochako when getting her pregnant. Now he had a perfect copy of her quirk and the quirks he gave their kids. "It's almost like All for One and One for All combined," Izuku thought with some unease, and he gulped at the thought of how much more overpowered this would make him if exploited. Izuku quickly shook his head to clear it of impure thoughts. "I already got Ochako pregnant. I can't just go around impregnating every girl in school," he chided himself. Boom. The two lovers were interrupted by the gates finally giving out, and they looked out the door to see Gyro and Hatsune running in while her giant mech and robot army guarded the gate. Izuku felt panic set in again, but before he could say anything, Ochako grabbed his hand and made him look at her. "Deku, could any of those quirks you made get us out of here without putting our babies in danger?" she asked, though it sounded like she already had an idea. Izuku pondered it for a moment. "Yes, but after how that one earlier affected me without practice, I don't think it's a good idea to use it yet," he whispered so Gyro wouldn't find them as fast. Ochako looked thoughtful then, as she averted her gaze with trepidation. "Then maybe you should give them what they want," she mumbled out quickly as her face burned and steam came out her ears. Izuku paused for a moment as he processed her words. Ochako slapped her hand over his mouth before he could shriek in shock and alert Gyro to where they were. "Izuku, I love you," Ochako started with a deadpan tone, "and after what you did to me, we are definitely going to keep having," she continued and kept his mouth covered, as he became very flustered. "But," she said, and an almost dark aura came over her as she glared up at Izuku, "I can not match your stamina," she punctuated each word. Her statement was further backed up by her legs nearly giving out and Izuku having to catch her. He gently but firmly picked her up and set her on the bed, where she took a second to orient herself with her added weight. She then locked eyes with Izuku. "I can probably go again if I'm okay with being useless the rest of the day, but I know you've been holding back this whole time and don't try to deny it. Little Deku says it all," she said while pointing downwards to Izuku's still hard erection. Izuku blushed deeply. They were both still naked after all, and Izuku had been trying his best to ignore it, but he couldn't deny that he was nowhere near spent. Ochako then grabbed Izuku by the cheeks and pulled him in close. "Izuku, I love that you want to be exclusive to me and understand this is all happening too fast for any of us, but with your quirk, if you fully satisfied yourself, you would pulverize me, so for my sake as well as theirs, go satisfy and claim those girls," she ordered Izuku. Izuku's brain blue-screened at his lover's command. Was the girl of his dreams, sometimes literally, really telling him to go and sleep with other girls, one of which was a friend to both of them? Ochako, I understand what you're saying, but I can't just take advantage of them like that. Not everyone would be happy with some guy essentially drugging them and getting them pregnant, and possibly ruining their chances with someone else, or possibly ruining their careers before they even start. Izuku whisper argued back. Ochako just gave him a deadpan look though. How did such an innocent and oblivious guy like you get a quirk like this? She muttered before taking a deep breath and looking him dead in the eyes. Izuku, every girl in Class A, heck probably even the whole school, has a crush on you, she explained. Izuku just stared blankly at her after that. He almost wanted to laugh, thinking it was a joke. After all, who would want to date a guy like him? Or at least that's what Izuku thought at first. But that gradually changed as Ochako continued to give him a deadpan look. But that's crazy. I'm just an average nerd. Izuku tired to defend his self-image, which didn't do his true character justice. Ochako merely arched an eyebrow at him as she made a point of scanning his body with her eyes. His incredibly ripped and scarred body that made nearly all of the girls drool during the more physically active classes. The same body that was so scarred because of his heroic actions that left a lasting impact on so many people, Class A included. Izuku suddenly felt the urge to cover himself as he was forced to acknowledge that he had indeed become quite the specimen in his years of training. Heck, if not for his adorable cinnamon roll stature and demeanor, he would be the pinnacle of masculinity, as Kirishima had many times attested to. Seriously, Ochako finally spoke. You do realize we've all been making passes at you for years, right? Hatsum especially, she said, and Izuku thought to deny it again, only to freeze as he thought back to all the times they'd interacted. How she would always get up close and personal, squishing her sizable assets against him or sandwiching his arm between them. Izuku's face fell as the realization struck him like a lightning bolt. What he had thought was just her quirky personality were actually the most blatant attempt at seduction the school would allow. Is it true he's every girl in class really? Izuku trailed off in thought, as his brain shorted out. He was abruptly brought back though, by a fragrance wafting up through the central ventilation. They're here, he whispered with dread as he tried to make as little noise as possible. Ochako grimaced though. She was getting frustrated with Izuku's lack of confidence and their shrinking time frame before Gyro tracked them down. It looked like she was going to have to give him one last push, so she grabbed him by the cheeks and pulled him in so she could whisper in his ear. Izuku, I was planning on throwing myself off a building to make you have to come and save me. If you got away from me here, she confessed and felt guilty as his muscles tensed like a bowstring. That's what they're all feeling right now. If you don't do something, they're going to hurt themselves or worse. And that's if their minds don't break like mine nearly did, she explained quickly to him. She hated manipulating Izuku like this, but it was the truth. His one-for-all enhanced quirk was just too powerful. It was making them that desperate, and if it went on too much longer, they would go insane if they didn't get themselves killed first, or hurt each other fighting over Izuku. She could tell Izuku's mind was in turmoil, but whatever he was thinking didn't get a chance to be voiced, as they soon heard doors being kicked in, somewhere down the hallway. She could see the panic setting in on Izuku's face but quickly pulled him in for a kiss. When they broke away, she mouthed the words go to him with a pleading look. Izuku hesitated but soon gave a weak smile as he decided to trust her. He then looked down to her pregnant belly and placed his hand over it before leaning down, giving it a kiss as well, before standing up. I'll be back soon, he whispered to her, and quick as a flash, grabbed his cloths and put them back on. He didn't bother with socks or underwear, and was still pulling on his top and one of his shoes, when he blasted out through the door and started running with full cowl. There he goes, and someone's already had him, Hatsum yelled as she rocketed past with a jetpack. Gyro falling behind as she panted for breath, apparently having been running for a while and exhausting herself. Damn it, remember our deal, leave some for me when I catch up, Gyro yelled after her temporarily partner as she stopped in front of Ochako's door and put her hands on her knees to hold herself up. Gyro glanced over into Ochako's and did a double take as she saw Izuku's fist conquest laying there. She had managed to cover her important bits with the sheets, but her very large and pregnant belly was completely exposed. Gyro's mouth fell open and all she could do was stare while Ochako smiled sheepishly and scratched the back of her head while rubbing her belly. Neither said anything. Ochako for not know what she could say in that situation, and Gyro for other reasons. Reasons that became apparent to Ochako as Gyro started breathing heavily again. Her face flushed as she rubbed her thighs together and squirmed. Then, with newfound strength and desire, she ran after Izuku and Hatsum. Get back, her Midoriya, she screamed after them as she ran. Ochako sighed as she listened for them, and once everything fell quiet, she pulled her sheet off. She then used her quirk on herself so she could actually stand and get dressed. She then smiled as she felt another kick. Don't worry, Papa will be back soon, she cooed to her belly. She had faith he would be back soon and would help support her. And she was confident he wouldn't be alone. Explosions echoed out from the walkway between dormitories. A green flash shot out and bounced off the walls like a pinball or a rabbit on coffee, as it dodged some kind of gray sludge that stuck to the wall he bounced off of, where it hardened like glue. Hatsum shot out of the hole in the building with her jetpack and discarded the now unusable glue cannon, only to pull out and unfold another high-tech gun. I'm running out of babies, Midoriya, so you better get back her and help me make new ones, she yelled after the green flashed as he stopped on the roof of the building to catch his breath. He didn't have long though, and had to jump out of the way of a net with spikes on the ends that dug into the roof. Whoa, just where do you keep all this support gear, Hatsum? Izuku yelped as he dodged another net and made a run for it. What followed was an unusual game of deranged cat and mouse, with Izuku running and hopping around as he dodged the hodgepodge of random gadgets that Hatsum shot, threw and swung at him, leaving a trail of broken scattered components. All the while, Hatsum was close behind with her jetpack propelling her forwards. However, Izuku's mind was in overdrive the whole time, plans and calculations running through his head as he muttered rapidly while flying through the air. Come on, Midoriya, think she's got to run out of gear eventually, but then again it's Hatsum, meaning it will take forever to run her dry and I can't afford to wait that long, Izuku thought as he shot past the dorms and took the opportunity to jump up and above the security wall and get better view. Shit, there are too many robots, he muttered with frustration. It wasn't that he couldn't deal with them. In fact, he could probably blitz past them or destroy them with relative ease. The problem was that it would draw too much attention and he couldn't go all out on the people. It would also take too long, especially if others showed up, and he wasn't leaving Ochako alone more than necessary. The idea of just bulldozing through and telling Nezu and Recovery Girl about Ochako had crossed his mind, but there was no guarantee that they could get to her fast enough for his liking. Not with Recovery Girl's advances age and Nezu's quirk not being suited for quick, decisive action. Not with an army of deathbots and superpowered girls standing between them and the dorms. Especially if the more desperate girls realized they could use Ochako as bait to catch him. Izuku shook his head. Leaving the area was just not an option in his mind. Not while Ochako was in such a vulnerable state. Bang! Izuku grunted in pain and surprise as he looked down to see a grappling hook, or claw really, latched to his left ankle. His planing having distracted him long enough for the mad mechanic to get hold of him. Gotcha, Hatsum exclaimed with glee as she grinned savagely up at him. Shit was all Izuku had time to say before she reeled him in like she was fishing. Izuku reacted quickly and used Black Whip to grab the security wall, and it soon became a tug of war with Izuku in the middle. Izuku grunted in pain as Hatsum didn't give up. He then charged his free leg with one for all and kicked at the claw gripping him. Clang! Only for his eyes to widen as sparks flew off from his iron soles scraping across the claw, but it didn't break. Haha, nice try, but you need full power to break this baby, Hatsum called out with glee. Izuku grimaced. If he used full power, the shockwave might hurt Hatsum at this range and he couldn't risk his bones breaking or even just straining them. Not unless he wanted to leave himself at the mercy of a horde of ravenous girls. If only he had a way to break the cable without using full power. If only he had a quirk that could. That's it, Izuku suddenly called out with excitement as the solution hit him. He then held out his free hand and concentrated. The pads on his fingers from Ochako's quirk had since vanished, but they weren't gone. Izuku focused inwards, like when he called forth one of the quirks in One for All, and this time, iridescent purple pads appeared, and between his curled fingers a singularity formed, this one much stronger than the first one he made. Izuku felt the tug on his stomach and the disruption of his orientation, but did his best to ignore it as he hurled the softball-sized black hole at the cable, and watched with satisfaction and pride as it ate right through it. Not unlike 13's quirk, which was admittedly the inspiration behind this one's design. Ah hey, no fair, Hatsum yelled as the grappling hook flew from her hands, due to the tension. Izuku would have kept smiling, if his cheeks weren't puffed out with bile, as he was pulled back to the wall like a rubber band. Izuku hit the wall and held on as he let the rainbows project from his mouth. Out of view of anyone, thankfully. Ugh, Izuku moaned as he wiped his mouth. He heard something flying through the air at him though and had to jump away, as a metal ball hit where he was and green gel spread on the wall. Izuku groaned in frustration as he hit the ground and started running for a nearby storage building behind the dorms. Hatsum gave her own frustrated groan as her jetpack finally gave up the ghost, and she watched him go. She wouldn't give up that easily though, as she pulled it off her back and slung it to the side, where it transformed into a rocket-powered scooter. You're not getting away again, she yelled as she blasted off after him and actually managed to close the distance. Izuku found himself sweating again as he looked over his shoulder at the girl chasing him. For every one of my babies you break, you're putting another one inside me, she promised with a maniacal grin that had Izuku shrieking in terror, and he punched his way into the building. Hatsum followed him in but screeched to a stop as she looked around but couldn't find him amidst a smokescreen. She twirled her scooter by the handlebars and it shifted into high-tech rifle. You can't hide forever, she called out as she pulled down her goggles to scan through the pinkish mist. She heard what almost sounded like someone slapping the walls of the empty building from several directions and caught glimpses of Izuku with her goggles, only for him to flash away. I don't need to, she heard him speak from behind her and started to turn, only to suddenly feel a slap on her ample rear. They both blushed deeply as Izuku rushed by. Hatsum from arousal and Izuku from mortification. He had been aiming for her back, but her chest took its place when she turned and he panicked. Hatsum was shocked and confused for a moment, but then hopeful that he was finally ready to get with the program. That hope only gave way to more confusion though, as she felt her butt being pulled in different directions, and suddenly she was pulled to the middle of the room, where she hung upside down in the air. Hatsum blinked in bewilderment as she hung there and finally saw Izuku as the smokescreen cleared. He had his hands raised as if in preparation to block an attack and saw the pads on his fingers had changed colors again. His right hand having red pads and his left having blue. Izuku quickly blushed and looked away though, as actual gravity pulled at her goggles, shirt and exposing her belly and accentuating her sizable assets, even as her shirt bunched up. Hatsune blinked back to reality and aimed her weapon at him and fired a sphere that split into two with a cable linking them, as they spun towards Izuku. Izuku was apparently still paying attention though, as he thrust his hands out with his wrists together and his palms out. The air rippled out, like two powerful magnets of opposing forces had been brought together and her shot was repelled. Izuku then used Black Whip to grab her weapon and toss it away, not trusting it to not be trapped. The two were quiet for a moment as they just stared at each other. "Okay, what was that?" Hatsune exclaimed, and Izuku was a little taken aback by how similar her personality was to when she wasn't under the influence of his quirk. Izuku just smiled though. "I don't have a name for it yet, but one hand is like a positively charged magnet, only with gravity, while the other is negative. So anything I touch with one hand will be attracted to whatever I touch with the other," he explained, unabashedly. He just couldn't help himself when asked how a quirk that he created worked. He soon realized the situation he was still in though and coughed into his hand as he looked away sheepishly. Hatsune blinked as she absorbed the information but then grinned at him. "Well, you got me. Now are you planning to have your wicked way with me?" she said while reaching up to squeeze her together. Izuku blushed and looked away. "Will be back," after he hesitated and took a moment to think, which caused Hatsune to grow worried. "I'll release the quirk soon," he said almost dejectedly, and Hatsune's eyes widened in fear and desperation. "Wait, Midoriya, you can't just leave me like this. Please, Midoriya." "Izuku, please don't go. Please just put your babies in me. I promise it will be fun," Hatsune begged, and Izuku hesitated, and his clenched fist trembled with guilt. He eventually made his decision though. "I'm sorry," he said and was gone in a flash. Even as he ran though, he was haunted by her desperate wails. Izuku felt tears running down his face. He knew what Ochako had told him but he just couldn't do it. He still held out hope that he could fix this without knocking up every girl on campus. Maybe if he could just hold out a bit longer, Recovery Girl could. Zap! Izuku ground to a halt. Danger sense, but why now, he thought as he looked around for whatever his quirk was warning him about. So far it hadn't alerted him to any of the girls since they didn't actually want to hurt him, so something else must have set it off. But then why didn't he see anything? Izuku's eyes widened then as he realized he wasn't the one in danger, and immediately shot off in the direction he felt danger sense leading him. Was one of the other students under attack? Were they about to hurt themselves as Ochako had warned? Or was something happening to Ochako and the babies? Izuku's stomach felt like he swallowed a basketball-sized hunk of ice, as that last possibility entered his mind, and he unconsciously upped the percentage of OFA as he ran with even more desperation. The idea that it might be a trap didn't even enter his mind. Then he heard it. The sound of a girl crying, and he jumped to the roof of the dormitory and looked down, only to gasp in shock at the sight of Gyro, leaning against the wall as tears fell from her eyes. Izuku was, to his guilt, relieved that it wasn't Ochako. But he was no less shocked or concerned that it was Gyro. He was also quite confused by the state Gyro was in. Leaning against the wall, in the shadow of the building, with her pants and black panties pulled down to her knees and fingering herself with one hand while holding herself up with the other, and she was bawling her eyes out. A truly disturbing sight for one who knew her well enough to recognize this wasn't like her at all. Izuku blushed deeply as he watched her from the opposite building and wanted to look away. But the fact that her life was somehow in actual danger kept him from doing so. Instead, he used float to drift down closer without her hearing him, so he could figure out what was wrong. Izuku felt the tug on his stomach getting worse though, due to time and using float. He hesitated and calculated the distance between here and the storage building, before deciding to release Hatsune from his quirk, before he could vomit again. Izuku gave a quiet sigh as his stomach stopped doing flips and he was able to focus on Gyro. But his blushing only got worse as he got closer and was given a better view of Gyro's thin legs and small, soft butt, and even a glimpse at her dripping womanhood. He was about to avert his eyes when Gyro moaned out, but not with pleasure. "Midoriya," she sobbed as she worked her fingers in and out of herself with more ferocity. "Damn it," she cursed as she banged her fist against the wall and tried to shove her fingers in further, but couldn't satisfy herself. She then cried out in rage and sorrow as she pulled her fingers out and beat her other fist against the wall until it brushed, and her knuckles bled. She then devolved into more sobbing as her black eyeliner ran down her face in streaks with her tears. "Damn it, Midoriya, why are we not good enough for you? Why can't you take me like you did your Araka Wui? Do you have to leave me so empty? I can't even relive myself anymore," she cried out as her voice went hoarse and weak, her body falling against the wall. "I can't catch you out, not after watching you running from Hatsune. I just can't keep you penned. You won't take us even when you have us begging for ya. What does your Araka have that we don't? Why won't you take us?" And make me scream like she did, make my belly swell like hers. Why, she continued as her body trembled. Izuku was shocked as he floated above the ground behind her. Ochako had warned him how bad the other girls could get, but he didn't truly understand it until now. Zap! Danger sense flared again as Gyro stopped trembling. She then slowly pushed herself up off the wall and stared at her own hands. "I can't go on like this," she spoke quietly, but Izuku heard it and his eyes widened, as he saw her raise her hands up and slowly grip her own neck. Just can't, she sobbed, and a pit formed in Izuku's stomach as he realized just how bad his quirk and refusal to act was affecting everyone. He knew she couldn't strangle herself with her hands alone, but there were many ways she could hurt herself. Gyro's breath began to quicken as her mind turned to darker places, but before she could even move, there was a sudden gust of wind against her back and warm, moist air against her nape. Gyro, Izuku spoke, and she froze up as her tormentor wrapped his strong arms around her, a feeling she had longed for but couldn't trust to stay. I'm so sorry, I should have realized sooner, Izuku spoke with a watery voice, as if he was crying as well. I'm sorry, I was planning on taking care of you first before Hatsuma because your quirk would let you find me no matter where I went, Izuku confessed. And it was true. Whether he smashed her or not, it was always the plan to go after Gyro first. A fact that made the poor girl gasp and blush, a bit of her real personality seeping back through. Gyro, I'm so sorry, I'll give you what you need now, he spoke, and Gyro's eyes widened, her broken mind too afraid to hope. Yeah. Her fears and doubts were banished though, and she screamed out in pleasure as her tight womanhood was instantly and roughly filled in its entirety, his tip pressing hard against her cervix, her feet leaving the ground slightly as she tilted her head to the sky, her mouth hanging open as she screamed like a banshee and let tears of relief and ecstasy fall from wide eyes. Izuku grunted as she constricted around his manhood like a hydraulic press, but he held himself back from pounding her to oblivion. Her delicate mind and body needed time to recover from the damage he'd done and the strain of being deflowered, so he held her up with her back resting against his face, impaled on his iron-hard manhood. Gyro eventually blinked herself back to awareness, her dark thoughts purged and leaving only desire and satisfaction as she looked down to see her lower belly bulging slight from Izuku's girth. "Oh yes," Gyro yelled before looking over her shoulder into the apologetic and embarrassed eyes of Izuku, who was still struggling to hold back his instincts to just bend her over and pulverize her. Her vocalization of her pleasure seemed to be his signal to stop holding back though, and he set her back on the ground before letting her arms go and grabbing her small hips and pulling out. Gyro felt a moment of panic, but it was quickly washed away as he smashed back into her, causing her to scream. "Ya Midoriya, thank you, oh God, thank you," she cried out as tears continued to fall and she had to place her hands on the wall to hold herself up, as Izuku wasted no time in pounding her tunnel hard and fast. Izuku grunted as he had to force his way in and out. "Got so tight," he moaned at her sheer tightness. She was definitely tighter than Ochako had been. Then again, Gyro was skinnier and a lot more petite than Ochako. She was also a lot more vocal, or at least more inclined to actually screaming than just moans and yells. Izuku couldn't help but find himself loving the sound she made as his pelvis slapped against her butt. The inexperienced Gyro screamed louder and Izuku actually had to slow down from how tight she became, as she climaxed. "Oh, you feel so good, Gyro," he said, hoping the compliments might help keep her mind from going back to dark places. It didn't matter though. Gyro's mind couldn't have been further from the broken state it had been, especially when her insides loosened up again and Izuku resumed his thrusting, this time grabbing her shoulders and pulling them back for leverage as he smashed her. Izuku's guilt began to fade to the back of his mind as he gave in to his instincts, like he had with Ochako. Only this time he wasn't quite so overwhelmed by them. He hadn't exactly been thinking how best to pleasure Ochako when he lost his ID to her. He just did what felt neutral. Now he was a bit more aware of his actions with Gyro, and he found he wanted to make her feel good. He needed to. So he leaned forward and kissed her neck. Gyro yelped amidst her screams and her jacks curled up from the contact. This encouraged Izuku to keep kissing her and even start sucking and even biting lightly, leaving hickeys and marking her as his. His left hand then moved around to grope her small cup breast through her shirt, causing Gyro to cry out again. He then reached under her shirt and brought a palm and squeezed her small, soft mound. Izuku couldn't help but marvel at the feel, but he also couldn't help growing concerned. His higher brain functions taking control again as he acknowledged that Gyro might be too petite to bear a large number of children at once safely. Her hips had already widened a little, opening up her birth canal, but it was still so tight thrusting in and out of her, and Izuku wasn't confident enough in his control of his quirk yet. Izuku grunted in both pleasure and worry as he finally penetrated her cervix and hit the back of her womb, causing her to orgasm and clenched around him. Izuku stopped moving to let her ride it out and to buy time for him to try and control his quirk. "Jirwa, at a safe day for you?" he asked as he leaned forward to speak in her ear. Gyro seemed to tense up at his words and took a moment before answering. Whether that was due to her orgasm or his words, he didn't know, but she seemed to sag in his arms as if saddened. "It is, I'm sorry, Izuku, I guess I can't muff." Izuku cut her off before she could get depressed again, by turning her upper body around halfway and grabbing her face so he could kiss her. When Izuku pulled away, he smiled at her. "It's ok, that won't matter," he assured her, but she just blinked in confusion. But then why she was cut off by a gasp as she felt a sudden burst of heat in her womb. Did it, she stuttered as Izuku smirked at her. I just wanted to know if you'd already ovulated, he explained, and Gyro looked at him with wide eyes, before she smiled widely at him with relief and desire and locked lips with him, sending her tongue into his mouth. She had to break away though, as Izuku resumed thrusting into her and she screamed. Izuku started to become somewhat frustrated though as he ran into the same problem as before. He couldn't come. He didn't understand it. He could feel himself on the verge of releasing, even as Gyro climaxed again herself, but he just couldn't finish. He also didn't get the same influx of information as before with Ochako. Was he missing something? Izuku's mind began to ponder this problem as his thrusting became more desperate, even to the point of activating one for all in hopes of attaining release, but only succeeded in pushing Gyro into another. Come on Izuku, quirks aren't magic. So I had to get that information somehow. Maybe I need to consume something like how I got one for all, he thought as he smashed Gyro at blinding speed. His eyes then widened as he remembered and his gaze locked on Gyro's covered. You gotta be kidding me, he grunted quietly between moans, but didn't really complain as he turned Gyro to face him. She yelped as his manhood twisted inside her and Izuku pulled her pants up enough so her legs weren't bound in an odd angle. Izuku then started pulling her shirt up and Gyro was all too happy to help as she grabbed her black bra and pulled it down over her. Izuku found himself drooling as he saw her perky breast with small pink nipples. He immediately started fondling and kneading them as he latched onto her right with his mouth. Gyro cried out as Izuku pushed her against the wall and began trusting again, her hands moving to his head while her legs wrapped around his waist. Izuku made sure to give attention to both as he enjoyed every moment but was still desperate to reach climax. Then he felt her grow. Not enough to go up cup sizes but enough to be noticeable. Then he tasted her milk and bliss hit him like a lightning bolt. Gyro screamed and climaxed yet again. Her legs started to go limp, so Izuku grabbed her left leg and held it up, as the other fell. Then it hit Izuku. All the information on Gyro's quirk and how many he need to make. Ah Gyro, I'm coming, he called out and Gyro's pupils dilated. Yes, come inside me GAH. ASMSH. They both yelled, their voices harmonizing as Izuku's manhood twitched and exploded deep inside Gyro. The rocker girl putting her vocals to the test as she screamed the loudest she had yet, as her belly bloated slight from being filled. Then her eyes rolled back in her head and she passed out. Izuku having to hold her up as her head rested in the crook of his neck, while he panted with half-lidded eyes and a grin of satisfaction. Izuku just stood there for a moment as he basked in afterglow. He soon blinked himself back to his senses though and immediately felt the guilt hit him. I did it again, he thought with dread as he slowly pulled out of Gyro and slid down to his knees and leaned her against the wall, and looked at her beautiful, smashed senseless and satisfied face. Izuku stared at Gyro for a long moment. His eyes then wandered down lower, to her slightly bloated belly, swollen with his seed. I did it again, I got my friend pregnant, Izuku muttered in despair. Tears began to leak from his eyes as he gripped his head and clenched them shut. He hadn't had a choice. Gyro would have hurt herself, had he done nothing. But if not for him and his quirk, Gyro wouldn't have been in that situation in the first place. None of the girls would be in this situation. Izuku nearly collapsed in on himself as he kneeled there in front of Gyro, his right hand clutching his chest as he started to sniffle. I did this to my friends and I enjoyed it, what kind of scumbag am I, Izuku sobbed. I'm becoming just like him, just like my father, getting girls pregnant, and then running off when things get hard, Izuku continued to sob. He didn't know how long he stayed there like that, but he was yanked from his self-loathing by an enraged growl, and a sharp tug at his long, prehensile earlobe. Oh, Izuku yelped and idly realized had coped Gyro's quirk. Such thoughts were quickly forgotten though, as he opened his puffy, red eyes, to see an enraged Gyro glaring at him with tear tracks stained black with mascara, as she gave an intense aura that promised death. Izuku flinched back, but then closed his eyes and let his head fall as he accepted his fate. This only seemed to enrage Gyro more though. Hey, eyes on me, Midoriya, she yelled at him as she tugged on his earjack again, forcing him to look up at her. Tears fell from his eyes like fountains as he locked eyes with the pissed-off rocker chick, who had only moments ago had pinned to the wall and screaming his name. Now he was going to pay the price for it as she aimed her own jack at his eye. Gyro's gaze was furious as she took a deep breath before speaking. Stop blaming yourself, she yelled, punctuating each word by inching her jack a little closer to his face. Izuku flinched back but she held him by his own jack, causing him to wince. His eyes then widened as he looked into Gyro's eyes with bafflement and shock. What muff, Izuku tried to speak but was cut off by Gyro grabbing his suit's collar and yanking him into a searing. Izuku made strangled sounds of protest, before surrendering to Gyro's passionate Frenching. Gyro finally released the lip lock and they both caught their breath, before Gyro pulled him in close to stare into his eyes with intensity. Listen here, Midoriya, losing my ID and having the absolute best series of orgasms of my life, while getting knocked up by my secret crush, is a way better alternative to torture by endless, otherworldly arousal, followed by insanity and suicide, Gyro yelled in Izuku's face. Izuku was stunned and stuttering under Gyro's gaze. He had expected to be castrated, not given support. But the reason why Izuku was cut off again, by Gyro shoving her jack in Izuku's left ear, and vibrating it painfully. I know I heard everything between you and Nezu. I get the gist of how your quirk works, she said, but paused as she glanced at Izuku's ear jack. Though apparently there's a little more to it, she muttered before turning her attention back to Izuku himself. So listen closely, Midoriya. This is not your fault. If you want to blame anyone, then blame your hack doctors, she continued. Her gaze then hardened. Or am I wrong, that you being forced to have with your friends and becoming a baby daddy makes you just as much of a victim as us, she challenged. Izuku was silent as he just stared into Jiro's eyes, his mouth hanging open. She was completely serious and Izuku couldn't say she was wrong. Everything that Ochako had tried to do with comfort, Jiro was now doing with tough love, and it left the poor boy stunned. Jiro's eyes then softened a little and she sighed. Then she pulled Izuku into a hug and stroked his hair gently. It's okay, Midori. Izuku are not a scumbag. You wouldn't have been trying to avoid us this whole time. If you were, you wouldn't have said no to Hatsune Ether. Jiro spoke softly to him as she held him close. Izuku was speechless as his arms dangled there limply. Then he slowly reached up and hugged her back, before he started crying again. He wasn't quite sure how long he stayed that way, but he felt his guilt fading away a little as he held Jiro close. Then he heard her gasp and he pulled away, only to see her eyes wide with shock. Then her gaze fell to her belly and Izuku followed it. Jiro's breathing picked up as they watched her belly grow rapidly, and Jiro had to place her hands on the wall behind her to hold up her growing weight. Jiro just stared down in shock as she breathed rapidly. Her belly wasn't as big as Ochako's, but it was still big for her petite frame. Holy shit, she muttered before hesitantly placing her hand on her pregnant belly. Holy shitty, I know I saw Ochako after you were done with her, but shit, I already couldn't feel my legs. There's no way I'm walking now, Jiro rambled. Izuku just sat there on his knees, frozen, not knowing what was going through Jiro's head or what she would be okay with him doing. Jiro, Izuku stopped himself as Jiro glared at him, daring him to apologize. Izuku swallowed. Is there anything I can do for you, he asked after considering his words carefully. Jiro smirked at him briefly before closing her eyes and leaning back against the wall. Just give me a minute, she said, and rested her hands on her belly. Izuku gave her just that, taking the opportunity to pull his pants up and sit cross-legged, instead of on his knees. And then he waited patiently for her to adjust. During that time, he gently took her hand that Shed punched the wall with and wrapped it with some bandages he kept in his suit's pockets. He then watched as her face went from uncertain to a gentle smile, and she began to rub her belly slowly, her thoughts finally settling. Izuku's gaze then fell to her pregnant belly and he reached his hand out as if to touch it, but stopped himself and pulled back. He then heard a frustrated groan and Jiro took both of his hands in hers. Jiro, he said as she held his hands. Kyoka, Jiro spoke as she looked him in the eyes. Call me Kyoko and stop acting like you're walking on eggshells, she said with a blush before placing his hands on her belly. This is your baby too and I want you in there alive, she said while averting her gaze, her more timid side coming back out. Izuku was stunned but couldn't help the smile that came to his face. Babies, he suddenly blurted out, causing Jiro to look back at him. I tried to hold back my quirk but I don't think it actually worked. So you're having twins, Izuku explained, though he was starting to suspect he couldn't produce anything less than twins. The upper limit he wasn't ready to test anytime soon. Jiro's eyes widened as she took in the information and looked down at her belly. Twinsy, I am going to be a mom to twins, she trailed off. Izuku waited for Jiro to process everything. Dodo, you want to know what they are, he asked, and Jiro blinked back to her senses before looking away with a blush and twirling one of her jacks on her finger. Two wouldn't say no if you wanted to tell me, she spoke quietly. Izuku smiled softly at her. So cute, he muttered quietly but then blushed profusely when he realized had said it out loud, and Jiro's face went atomic red. B-boys, they are both boys, Izuku sputtered quickly, trying to change topics. Jiro blinked a few times before she gave a soft smile and rubbed her belly. Izuku smiled as he watched her, but then finally took real notice of his new appendages, and as he focused on them, he managed to move his jacks up into his view. He then noticed the muffled, extra layer of sound he was hearing. His eyes then fell on Jiro's belly again and he got an idea. Kyoka, can I see one of your jacks, Izuku asked with a blush. Jiro looked confused by his request but extended her left jack to him. Izuku smiled as he grabbed his own right jack and then took her offered one in the same hand. He then pressed his hand to her belly and Jiro gasped. Wide grins then spread across both their faces and some tears fell from the both of them as they heard two sets of distinct and rhythmic thumping. Two heartbeats, strong and fast. Izuku wasn't sure had ever seen such a wide smile on Jiro's face before she held a hand over her mouth, her other hand resting over Izuku's as she closed her eyes to focus on the wonderful sound. Izuku did the same and his mind couldn't help but dip into fantasy as he listened. He could practically see it. His children wearing his old All Might onesies and with sheets tucked behind their shirts' collars like capes as they played hero with him. Kyoka and Ochako sitting on a nearby couch with pink and blue bundles in their arms. Izuku was quickly ripped from the wonderful vision though and his eyes shot wide. Ochako, he suddenly called out, startling Jiro. I forgot about Ochako, oh I hope nothing's happened to her, what if her water already broke while I was gone? Izuku began to panic. Before he could run off half though, Jiro hit him between the eyes with her jack. Calm down, Midoriya. Gravity girl's fine, you can hear her from here if you listen, she said. only slightly peeved that he ruined such a nice moment. Izuku blinked at her in confusion, before she rolled her eyes and demonstrated by plugging her free jack into the ground. Izuku resisted the urge to slap himself as he flashed Gyro a sheepish grin. He then held up the jack he wasn't holding to Gyro's belly and looked at it before glancing at the ground. He then aimed his jack and thrust it down. Tap! Izuku winced as he failed to put enough force into his thrust and his jack bounced off the ground, making his ear ring. Gyro couldn't help but chuckle at Izuku. It took a while for me to get through wood when I was younger, and years to get through concrete, she explained. Izuku just furrowed his brows though, as he focused on driving his jack into the ground. Green lighting arced over his jack, as he accidentally activated One for All. Banged! Gyro's cheeks puffed out as she tried to contain her laughter at Izuku's expression. His entire body trembled and his head spun as his ears rang like a bell. His teeth felt like they were vibrating painfully in his skull. Izuku shook his head clear and rubbed his ear in an attempt to relieve the pain. He gradually came to a stop though, as his hearing became clear. Wow, Izuku muttered as he covered both his ears and closed his eyes, listening to all the sounds around them in a chaotic jumble. He slowly was able to start differentiating each sound though. Insects and birds. The hum of power lines. Hatsume's army of robots fighting off some girls he didn't recognize. And Ochako. He could hear her clear as day, humming a lullaby. Happy and safe. Wow, this is how you hear things, he asked Gyro with amazement as he opened his eyes, only to pause as he saw Gyro taking off her bra. Gyro, what are you doing? He asked with a deep blush. Gyro froze up and blushed in kind. It doesn't fit anyone, she muttered before finishing taking it off and pulling her shirt down, though she couldn't get it over her belly. Izuku blushed and averted his eyes, feeling bashful once again. His attention was quickly grabbed by a frenzied sound through his jack though. It was almost like a rabid animal, and Izuku remembered his jack was still in the ground. Izuku was confused though. It didn't sound like anything he could remember. Damn you, Midoriya, he heard through his jack and his eyes widened. Shit, it's Hatsume, Izuku spoke with fear, before yanking his jack out of the ground. Gyro's own eyes widened as she too heard it. Oh shit, after you left her hanging high and dry, she's going to be ravenous, she commented as she did her best to buckle her pants up around her belly. Gyro then yelped as Izuku picked her up bridal carry. And Midoriya, she stuttered with a heavy blush that was mirrored on Izuku. You said you couldn't feel your legs, right? And I need to get you somewhere safe before Hatsume finds us, Izuku stuttered. And Gyro buried her face in his chest to hide her embracement, while internally squealing with joy that Izuku was giving her a princess carry. The green-clad hero then ran out from between the buildings at a more natural pace than when the girls chased him before, not wanting to risk hurting Gyro and their babies. Izuku made his way quickly towards Ochako's dormitory. Ochako lay in bed, humming gently. She had since gotten some feeling back in her legs and had put on some clothes. Of course, none of it fit right anymore. None of her bras fit, and you could tell through her pink shirt, which now acted more like a crop top, due to her belly being too big, and none of her pants or skirts fit either, so she settled for just her, stretched too thin, pink panties. Right now, she had her laptop out and resting on her belly, doing research on pregnancies and giving birth, as well as where to buy baby clothes and supplies for cheap, while waiting for Izuku to get back. The reason why Ochako was using her laptop instead of her smartphone. She didn't have one. Yep, her family was still dirt poor and Ochako was still rocking the flip phone. She briefly considered contacting her parents, but decided against it. Nezu was probably handling things outside the school and he didn't need her messing things up. Besides, didn't want her dad trying to break in to kill her baby daddy. Speaking of, Gyro's screams of ecstasy had died down a while ago, so Ochako was confident Izuku would be back with Gyro soon. That led to another concern for Ochako though, namely how her and Izuku would support their children. They were only days away from graduation, so employment shouldn't be an issue, provided the repercussions of today didn't cause problems. Ochako was also hoping her and Izuku's hand-me-downs from their own infant years would help, but it would be hard to stretch those between triplets. And that wasn't including the babies Gyro was no doubt carrying now, and the many more to come from the other girls or even Ochako, if she couldn't restrain herself after this was all over. Though the other girls may have their own hand-me-downs to contribute. That line of thinking led Ochako to one student in particular, but she shook her head to clear it of evil schemas. She may be greedy, but she wasn't going to manipulate the situation with Izuku's quirk for money. Though she wouldn't complain if a certain, well-endowed, rich girl, who shall not be named, got knocked up by Izuku and had to provide financial support. Ochako slapped her cheek. No, bad Ochako, bad. You need to set a good example for you babes although. Financial stability is something you should always strive for. Ochako trailed off with an evil glint in her eye. She quickly slapped her face again. No, think of something else. Think of something else, like what color our baby's hair will be, or if they'll have my rosy cheeks, or Izuku adorable freckles, or Izuku. Ochako trailed off. Suddenly, her innocent thoughts of her future family were replaced with less innocent thoughts of her lover. Not for the first time since realizing her crush on him, she found herself fantasizing about his toned and rippling muscles, his calloused and scarred body that contrasted perfectly with his adorable, cinnamon roll face. Ochako's breath shuddered slightly as she licked her lips and her hand started unconsciously inching down to her lower regions. Not KNCOK. Ah, Chako yelped as she was torn from her fantasy, and quickly retracted her hand like she'd touched a stovetop. Ah, Chako, it's me, Izuku called from the other side of the door as the girl got her breathing under control. Izuku, it's unlocked, she called back as she closed her laptop and set it on her nightstand. The door opened and Achako was treated to the sight of a heavily pregnant Gyro in Izuku's arms. Izuku had also retracted Gyro's quirk back into himself like with Achako's, turning his ears back to normal. Oh, hey Gyro, I see you and Deku worked things out, Achako said with a sheepish smile, not really knowing how to talk about any of this. Gyro just blushed and looked away as she clung tighter to Izuku, who also looked uncomfortable with the situation. Achako then scooted over a little to make room on her twin-sized bed, as Izuku walked over to set Gyro down and she gave a relieved sigh. An awkward silence then fell over them all, as Izuku just stood there, rubbing his neck. Izuku tried to speak but couldn't decide on what to say. As the silence stretched on, they all became more uncomfortable. Gyro in particular felt the pressure and gripped the sheets below her. Eventually she couldn't take it anymore. Alright, I'm just going to come right out and say it. This situation is no pun intended. But we're here now and you still need to go deal with Hatsum while me and Uraraka work out the details, she told them bluntly. All three were blushing at her proclamation. Details, Izuku asked with a nervous sweat, but Gyro just held up her hand. That's between us girls. You need to focus on Gadget Girl though, Gyro said, but then narrowed her eyes at him. You are going to help Hatsum, right? Because what she's going through is torture, Gyro asked, and Izuku suddenly became as serious as he could look while blushing. Of course I am. I understand that I can't run away from this anymore, so I'm going to go find Hatsum. And I'm going to Izuku started strong but found himself struggling to finishing. I am going to finally put your babies in her. Izuku shrieked as Hatsum finished for him from the doorway. Izuku didn't even get the chance to turn and face her before he was suddenly bound by a strong metal cable. Glad to see you're finally getting with the program, but you're still not getting off that easy after you literally left me hanging with only a love tap. Hatsum finished with a dark tone that promised suffering through pleasure. Izuku found himself screaming in fear as he was suddenly yanked out of the room and tossed through the door on the opposite side of the hallway, where he landed on Momo's bed. Don't worry ladies, I'm sure that with his quirk, there'll still be plenty left for you after I'm done with him, Hatsum promised before closing the door to Achako's room, leaving both girls red as tomatoes and steaming. They would soon find it very hard to discuss anything, due to the sounds that soon echoed through the dormitory. Izuku yelped as he was tossed unceremoniously on Momo's large and luxurious bed, his arms still bound at his sides. He then rolled onto his back to see Hatsum's silhouette in the doorway. The lights were out and the curtains pulled closed. So when Hatsum shut the door, all he had was a little ambient light, leaking in from between the blinds. He saw Hatsum's silhouette press something on her wrist and his bindings came loose, but before he could sigh in relief, the thick metallic cable split into four and snaked up and down his body, cutting his suit to ribbons and leaving him naked as they latched themselves tightly to his wrists and ankles, before attaching themselves to the four bedposts. Izuku gasped as he suddenly found himself stretched spread eagle on the bed, his still hard erection exposed and at full mast. Izuku broke out in a nervous sweat as he tugged on the cables with one for all. It's pointless, Midoriya, I know you want use full power to break free with us so close to the blast zone, Hatsum spoke, and Izuku's fearful gaze snapped to her silhouette as she peeled off her support gear, before getting to her clothes. And then now Hatsum can talk about this, Izuku tried weakly to bargain, only to gasp as Hatsum jumped onto the bed and straight onto him. Her wide, childbearing hips sat against his abs, with his erection flush against her thick and soft butt. Her thick legs locked tightly at his sides as she straddled him and her strong arms held her up so her C-cup ass, with large, erect nipples, hung tantalizingly before his face. Izuku's breath caught in his throat as he watched her beautiful mammaries bounce and sway just out of reach. The scent on her was very strong compared to most of the other girls around Yue, causing his erection to throb. It was like he could instinctively tell Hatsum was well suited to childbearing. Izuku swallowed as Hatsum lifted her hips, giving his a view of her drenched womanhood. His gaze then turned up to her grinning face. No more running and no more wasting time. You own me some babies and they're going inside me now, she proclaimed before swiftly bringing her dripping womanhood down on Izuku's tool, and throwing her head back to yell out with pleasure along with Izuku. There was even less preamble with Hatsum than the others. She knew what she wanted and she immediately started riding Izuku like her life depended on it. She placed her calloused hands on Izuku's shoulders as she bounced on him quickly and forcefully, her toned muscles from working in the support department earning their keep as the bed shook and bounced against the wall. Izuku could only groan in pleasure and watch as Hatsum's body contorted and rolled over him, her ass swaying back and forth over him. She then pushed herself up and really started bouncing, moaning and crying out as her ass bounced with her. Yes, 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 put it in me, put your babies in me, Midoriya, give me as many as you can, Hatsum yelled and Izuku gasped. It was like Switch had been flipping him. As if her cries had been the magic word and his manhood penetrated her womb much faster than the others, sending her crashing into her fist orgasm, and she convulsed atop him, before resuming her bouncing. Hatsum then gasped as she placed her hands on her belly. "Yes, you just made me ovulate," she cried out, to Izuku's surprise. Things were happening a lot faster than with the others. It was almost like Hatsum's desire to be knocked up was stimulating his quirk. "Yes, do it again, make me ovulate more, fill me to bursting," Hatsum ordered as she gripped the bed frame above her and used it to pull and push up and down with more force and speed. Izuku felt desire and pleasure overwhelmed him as his quirk flared up and his limited control of it slipped. Hatsum then cried out with pleasure as she ovulated a second time. "Yes, again, don't stop," she screamed and began periodically crying out in both climax and ovulation. Izuku couldn't tell which was which as she continued to pound him into the mattress and cause it to shake and groan as it banged against the wall and nightstand. Izuku grunted as he pulled against his restraints. Hatsum was the least tight out of the girls Izuku had so far, but it was no less pleasurable, especially with the sight before him and the words coming out of her mouth, playing to his quirk-induced fetish. But there was just one problem as Hatsum continued to ride him towards yet another orgasm. He wasn't able to finish. Hatsum had succeeded in her desire to torture him with pleasure, but unknowingly condemned herself to the same punishment, as even she was starting to get impatient with Izuku's lack of release. Izuku clenched his eyes shut as he strained against his bindings. There was no guarantee that Hatsum would comprehend his words in her current state, so he needed to free himself or this might not end well. He couldn't use 100% without hurting Hatsum and possibly the girls in the other room. But One for All wasn't his only quirk anymore, and he struggled to reach his index finger to a particular spot on his bindings. Meanwhile, Hatsum's bounces became all the more desperate as she still felt the lack of Izuku's seed in her babymaker. Her plan had backfired spectacularly and now she was once again the one subject to torture by desire. By that thing just out of reach. She was so lost in need and desperation that she didn't hear the clicking sound of Izuku's restaurants falling off. She was pulled from her delirium by Izuku's strong arms grabbing her and she yelled as they suddenly switched positions. Hatsum gradually came back to her senses and blinked with surprise at Izuku, as he looked down at her with dangerous hunger and intensity. He was peeved with her and Hatsum was suddenly a little scared of what he would do. But one question still remained though. How did you break free, she asked, and Izuku held up his hand to reveal his fingernails was now metal, and what looked like a cross between a lockpick and Gyro's jacks popped out from underneath his index finger, before retracting and turning back to normal. Hatsum didn't get to say anything else though, as suddenly she was bound by her own gadget, reprogrammed by Izuku, and suddenly she was the one bound and exposed to him. Then Izuku growled with lust and frustration as green lightning arced across his body. Hatsum immediately realized her mistake in thinking she could subdue and match Midoriya, as her eyes widened in fear and desire, just before she screamed as Izuku began plowing her. "Ahhhhhhyyesss." She cried out as the large bed actually bounced off the ground a little with each powerful thrust Izuku gave her. The whole room shaking with books and other knickknacks falling to the floor and the wall behind the bed caving in from the impacts. Izuku's hands immediately went to Hatsum's ass without heed of the damage they were causing, and he began harshly squeezing and sucking them viscously. Hatsum cried out in repeated orgasm as Izuku bit, pinched and pulled her nipples, while working the tender flesh with his strong hands. His pounding of her pelvis did not slow or diminish through all of this. Then her ass grew in size quickly, actually going up a cup size to D, and milk shot out of her left like a fountain, while Izuku greedily drank from the other. Izuku then freed her legs and pushed them up to her head, folding her into a mating press as he began smashing her faster, one of the bed's legs breaking and putting them at an angle. Hatsum just continued to yell in incredible pleasure until Izuku finally released her ass, his head filled with the information he needed and his release finally imminent. "Ah, I'm cuming, Hatsum. I'm getting you pregnant," he called out to her, too lost in the moment to care who hurt him. Hatsum couldn't respond, as she could do scream louder and moan and yell wantonly as her tongue hung out, and they reached climax together. In the moment right before though, Izuku's eyes widened to comical degrees at the number of quirks he had to make. He was just glad he already had ideas planned out beforehand, thanks to his years of studying quirks. And with that, he finally achieved release, yelling before moaning long and deep with pleasure as he exploded deep within Hatsum, causing her to scream. Izuku then collapsed on top of Hatsum and rolled off her as her legs fell back down, her face the epitome of smashed, senseless and satisfied as she mumbled deliriously while gazing with half-lidded eyes at nothing. Izuku was breathing heavily as his body trembled, but not from exhaustion. He was very satisfied by Hatsum and could easily go several more times before tiring. The issue was the quirks. Izuku clenched his eyes shut to prevent sensory overload as his eyes switched between crosshairs, spirals, glowing and a few others constantly, and his body steamed a little. It was just too many quirks all at once. Eventually it stopped and Izuku sighed in relief. He then opened his blurry eyes, but his vision quickly cleared and became sharper than ever. His eyes then shot wide and his sharp gaze locked in on Hatsum's belly. "Holy shit," he muttered with a new fear of his quirk. "I cannot afford to lose control of this quirk again," he muttered with dread. Hatsum could probably handle this many babies, but had he done this to someone petite like Gyro, he might have seriously hurt her. Izuku shakily pushed himself up off the skewed bed and grimaced. Sorry, Momo, he apologized, unaware of what was behind him. Ho-oh, Izuku yelped as he was bound once again and yanked back out of the room. Only this time by Gyro's jacks, which swiftly released him as he landed on Achako's bed. His eyes then boggled as he looked up to see Achako guiding Gyro around as she floated under the influence of Achako's quirk. Her legs still too weak to support her. Both girls were also completely naked. Izuku's eyes couldn't help wandering over them. Their womanhoods drenched and their leaking a little where they had been attempting to pleasure themselves until Izuku finished with Hatsune. Izuku watched as Achako pulled Gyro along with her towards the bed. WW, what are you doing, Anno? My quirk isn't affecting you again, is it? He asked in fear and confusion. Gyro pressed her jack against his lips to stop him from talking. No, your quirk isn't affecting us, Izuku, she said as Achako set her down on the bed next to Izuku. BB, but then what? Izuku gasped as Achako straddled him and placed her hands on his shoulders as she glared down at him along with Gyro. You big dummy, did you honestly think you could force us to listen to that and not have to give us some attention afterwards? Too, Achako spoke, and Izuku's eyes bugged out as his heart skipped a beat. If what they said was true and they weren't being influenced by his quirk, then did that mean they wanted him? Without the influence of his quirk, they were offering themselves to him. No, they weren't offering. They were demanding his loving embrace and affections. They were demanding he visit his true, carnal desires upon them. Not spurred on by his quirk-induced arousal or guilt-tripped into it by their own deteriorating mental states. They truly wanted him and he wanted them in turn. Izuku's brain shorted out as he realized this. Realized that the girls had knocked up and endangered the careers of, still wanted more from him. Achako's words of love now rang all the truer as he watched her lift herself up. Her sore legs be damned, she needed her Deku inside her now. Izuku quickly grabbed her hips to stop her though. Wait, Achako, you're pregnant. What if? Izuku was silenced by Achako's finger over his lips. I did some research while you were out with Gyro and it's safe so long as you don't smash me as hard as before, Achako promised. Izuku was surprised by her words and was contemplating if he should trust her judgment or wait for a second opinion. His thoughts wouldn't matter though, as Achako seized his moment of hesitation and forced her hips down. Both cried out as pleasure claimed them. Achako then leaned back, letting her pregnant belly stick out as she moved her feet forward, while she held herself up with her hands on Izuku's knees. Izuku gripped Achako's ankles as he gazed upon her. The sight of her heavily pregnant belly beginning to bounce up and down on him was so arousing for him. It caused his manhood to throb inside her. Gyro then placed her hand on his cheek and made him look at her while Achako cried out. She then at him while fingering herself. Izuku broke to breathe heavily, still too stunned by what was happening to really make a move. Izuku finally surrendered to his desires though, as he let go of one of Achako's ankles to squeeze Gyro and cause it to leak, as he ate her again. Gyro then broke away with a smirk though as she made Izuku look back to Achako. Use your jacks on her, she told him, and Izuku blinked with surprise and confusion. Gyro then leaned back and pointed out a spot on her own womanhood to Izuku. Make them vibrate and touch her here, she instructed. Izuku wasn't quite sure what any of this meant, but he wasn't about to say no to either of them. So he did as instructed, bringing his ear jacks back out and making them vibrate in tune with his heartbeat, and extended them to touch the small butt at the top of Achako's entrance. Achako's eyes flew open and she threw her head back as she suddenly screamed out and clenched around him before squirting on his length. Izuku's own eyes widened at the reaction he got, but also as he cried out in climax from how tightly she gripped him. It seems he didn't need to worry about getting blocked with girls head already smashed. Achako then fell back while sliding off him, her face the symbol of satisfaction as she lay there. Izuku's gaze was soon pulled to Gyro, when she yanked his face back to hers. My turn, she said, and she rolled onto her back and spread her weak legs for him. Overcome by desire, Izuku offered no complaint, as he got up on his knees and positioned himself at her entrance. He then grabbed her legs for leverage as he gently pushed in. Unlike before, impregnation wasn't the goal. Now it was just pleasure in expressing his love for these girls who truly wanted him. And so he started off slow, eliciting satisfied moans from Gyro as he slowly built up speed. Yeah, just like that, oh so good, Gyro called out as Izuku grunted. He was careful not to thrust too hard or fast and was especially careful not to activate one for all. He did decide to use what Gyro had taught him though and extended his jacks down to her sensitive spot and vibrated them. Ahhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhhh She achieved climax. Ugh, Kyoka, Izuku called out as he climaxed as well, gripping her legs tightly. Izuku smiled down at Gyro as she panted for air. He was happy to know he could satisfy his girls without having to torture himself. He then felt the bed shift. Hey, don't forget me. All three of them froze in shock at Hatsume's voice. They couldn't believe she was still conscious after what Izuku did to her or that she somehow made it into this room. She probably used one of her support items. Their eyes all shot even wider though, as they turned to see her laying at the end of the bed, next to Ochako, with her legs spread wide and an extremely pregnant belly. Holy shit, just how many did Izu put in you? Gyro yelped with shock and fear. Izuku blushed and looked away in embarrassment. Is pregnant with octuplets, Izuku admitted weakly, and the girls stared at him with shock and a little fear. Hatsume just giggled though. It's a good start, but remember, you still owe me a lot more, she exclaimed, much to their shock. Even when free of Izuku's quirk and filled to bursting, Hatsume wanted more. What, did you think I was joking when I said you would put one in me for each of my babies you broke? In fact, I'm starting to rethink that how about we make it 2 for each you broke, she said with a sinister laugh. She then pulled her legs further apart before Izuku could protest. Now come on. I'm too big and sore to do it normally, so it's time you learned how to pleasure a woman in other ways, she ordered Izuku with a savage grin. The girls would learn over the next hour just how vast Izuku's stamina and ability to learn was, and be all the weaker in the knees for it. Izuku stared at the ceiling of Ochako's room. His mind was somehow both short-circuited and refreshed at the same time. It was like his brain had undergone a reboot as he lay there, just staring and trying to process everything that had happened over the last few hours. First, he had made a horrifying discovery about himself, then had been running around the school in a frenzy, trying to evade everyone, then had done something that, at the time, seemed so horrible to him that he wanted to vomit. Now he didn't know what to think of his situation and quirk. All he could do was lay there and stare upwards as he felt the warm bodies pressed against him. Finally, he blinked away the haze and looked to his right, and was met with Ochako's adorable face, as she rested with her head on his shoulder, having since passed out from his terrifyingly successful efforts to satisfy her. He hugged her close with his right arm around her shoulder and her naked body pressed to his. A thin sheet spread wildly over them. Her ass and pregnant belly pressed against his side, letting him feel the occasional kick. He then felt another kick from his other side and looked to his left to see Gyro, in much the same state, with her leg laying across his body. Her serene and adorable smile a new experience for him. His gaze then traveled down, to see Hatsume on her side and clinging to his left leg, sandwiching it between her large ass as another sheet covered her. Then his gaze fell front and center to the tent he was pitching even now, after satisfying himself with the girls so many times. Ochako was right. If I ever fully satisfied myself, I would destroy them, Izuku thought before letting his gaze return to the ceiling. His mind swimming as he tried to comprehend the situation he found himself in. And in spite of the circumstances, and the guilt he felt, he couldn't deny that the last hour had been the best of his life so far. How could it not be? 3 beautiful girls, the mothers of his children, had willingly spent the last hour making love to him, with every indication they wanted to do it again. Izuku closed his eyes and took a deep breath as he felt truly happy, in spite of himself. In spite of everything and in spite of his guilt, he felt like the luckiest man alive right now, and he pulled his girls closer to himself like a greedy miser, refusing to let go of his precious treasures. He couldn't deny it any longer. These girls wanted him and he wanted them back. That left an important question in his mind though, as he looked at Gyro. What are we to each other, he thought, before turning his gaze back to Ochako. With her it wasn't even a question. He loved her and she loved him. He was confident boyfriend and girlfriend applied at the very least, and probably even fiancé very soon. But what about Gyro and Hatsume? Izuku glanced over at the both of them. He liked them and definitely found them attractive. And they apparently liked him and had for a long time. But Izuku had been oblivious the whole time. The only one he ever really knew he had feelings for was Ochako. But the others he just didn't know yet. He could probably come to love Gyro in short time. Probably after a few dates, but Hatsume. Maybe after she calmed down and he got to have a good talk with her and then a few dates. He now knew she had been making passes at him for a long time now, but after how she acted even after his quirk stopped affecting her, he needed to make sure she wasn't just using him to satisfy her impregnation fetish. He would stick around and support her and their children, but he wasn't about to have a one-sided relationship. If she really wanted to go beyond being just his baby mama and actually have more babies with him like she said, then she needed to prove she was committed and actually had feelings for him. Izuku sighed and closed his eyes. I guess I have a harem now, he muttered in disbelief, but then chuckled lightly. Mine is going to lose it when he finds out, he said quietly, but his eyes shot open as he heard giggling to his right. He looked over to see Ochako's eyes blearily opening as she giggled, before smiling softly at him. Yeah, he'll probably have a heart attack before trying to murder you, she said as she held her lover close with a grin. Yeah, especially after you get to the other girls, Gyro spoke as she woke up as well, and Izuku looked over at her tired but happy face. Hey, did I wake you? Izuku asked the 2 girls who clung to him tighter in response. No, it was the 2 gremlins kicking my bladder, Gyro said with a playful grin, as she moved her hand to rub her belly affectionately. Izuku smiled at her as he gently rubbed her shoulder before moving his hand down lower towards her belly. He couldn't quite reach with his arm wrapped around her, but he got close enough to rub her side, where it began to descend outward. Gyro smiled as she snuggled up to him and Izuku returned it. His mind began wandering back to his earlier pondering, and he considered asking them. Ochako gave a sigh before he could speak through, and it didn't sound like the content one he would expect. I guess we need to figure out what to do now. We can't stay here forever after all, and the longer we keep you to ourselves, the worse things will get out there, Ochako said, and Izuku's head snapped to her and her face that said she didn't want to leave this bed. Izuku then looked to the ceiling again as he hugged the girls tightly for support. That's right. I have to get the girls somewhere safe where they can give birth. Then I have to go and help the other girls on campus, Izuku thought with a deep blush, and steam rising from his head. He then felt Hatsum stirring down by his leg. Yep, my darlings out guarding the gate won't last forever, and I'm sure the decoys of you I send out are probably all busted by now, she spoke as she stretched out as much as she could and rolled over on her back. The other girls had to grab hold of the sheets to keep them from getting pulled away by Hatsum's very large belly. Izuku just blinked though, before looking down at Hatsum. Decoys, he asked, and Gyro chuckled sheepishly, drawing his attention. Yeah, we wanted you all to ourselves, so I had Hatsum make some decoys and send them running around the school to keep the others busy. That's probably the reason Mei's robots haven't all been destroyed yet, Gyro explained. Izuku blinked at her in surprise but then smiled. That was actually incredibly helpful. Maybe it was a good thing he recruited Hatsum so early in his conquests. Izuku blushed deeply at the thoughts running through his head and looked back up. He quickly got his head straight again though, as he started pondering their situation. Can any of you walk, he asked, only to receive boisterous laughter from Hatsum. After the things you did to us, not a chance, she answered, and the other girls sighed with a mix of satisfaction and frustration as they nodded in agreement. Yeah, I can't feel my legs at all, Deku, and my hips are too sore to support my normal weight, Ochako admitted, and Izuku gave her an apologetic smile as he rubbed her side. Ochako's smile said she was anything but displeased though, as she rubbed her cheek on his shoulder and ran her hand over his chest. Izuku couldn't fight the grin that came to his face. The fact that he could reduce 3 girls to such states in less than an hour and keep pleasuring them stroked his ego in a way he never could have imagined. He quickly shook such thoughts from his head though and began thinking. We need to get you 3 to recovery, girl, but also need to avoid everyone else. Me and Ochako might be able to help with her quirk, but there's no telling how pregnancy will affect how long she can maintain it. And I still need practice. Mutter, 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 mutter. The girls just stared at Izuku as he began another mutter spree. Then Ochako and Gyro looked at each other and giggled at their man's goofy habit. Izuku suddenly stopped and looked a little guilty as an idea came to him. Hey, do you think the others would calm down and let us pass if I promised to give them what they want later? He trailed off weakly with a face that grew progressively more scarlet. No, the girls all immediately deadpanned in unison, shocking Izuku. The greenet looked to his girls with surprise and confusion. Me and Hatsum may have had a deal, but it was flimsy at best and doomed to fail at worst, Gyro began, and Hatsum nodded in agreement. Yeah, from the start I was already planning how to get her out of the way so I could have you all to myself, she admitted unabashedly, and Ochako gave an exasperated groan. Yeah, we may still be a while like that, but we're not thinking things through. It'll like being addicted to you and having been in withdrawal for days, Ochako explained, much to Izuku's mounting horror and shame. So you're saying, Izuku trailed off with dread. They are not going to cooperate or be civil about any of this, even if you say yeah, I'll give them what they want. They might say they will at first and believe it, but the moment they see someone else getting you first, they'll lose it. Yeah, I'll have to. Gyro trailed off with a blush. Do them one at a time, and make sure no one else is around to kill them out of jealousy, Hatsum finished for her, without a hint of shame or decorum, which caused everyone else to blush deeply and cover their faces. Dang it, we're back to square one then, Izuku spoke with frustration. Knock, knock, knock. Everyone jumped in shock as their eyes flew to the door. What the did someone slip past the robots, or did they finally go down? Gyro whispered as she sat up and held the sheets to her chest. Izuku took a deep breath. I don't smell anything. It might be Nezu or recovery girl, no. Ochako was able to hide using perfume, Izuku muttered before using float to get out of bed without making the girls move. He looked around and quickly found his underwear that had left behind after his first time with Ochako. Hatsum had shredded his suit after all, so it was all he had. He carefully made his way to the door as he slid on his underwear and manifested Gyro's quirk. He got into a ready stance as he plugged the jack into the wall and listened. He heard breathing, almost like through a respirator, and a tapping foot, but nothing else to indicate who it was. Izuku glanced over at the girls, covering themselves with the sheets, or at least Ochako and Gyro were. Hatsum didn't seem to care as the sheets were moments away from falling off her. Izuku grimaced as he realized they still couldn't move on their own, and he back his fist. He didn't want to hurt whoever it was, but he would prioritize his girls and unborn children first. He retracted and reabsorbed the jacks as he reached for the doorknob and yanked it open, only to be met with the puffy marshmallow of an astronaut suit, staring him down. 13. They yelled in shock and Izuku's body tensed for action. Whoa, calm down, Midoriya, I'm not here to do anything to you, 13 cried out as she waved her hands in surrender. Izuku froze up and they all just blinked at her in confusion. Wait, you're not affected by my quirk? Izuku asked with a tilt of his head. 13 simply raised her hand and rapped her knuckles against her glass helmet, causing them all to deadpan. Right spacesuit, Izuku muttered as he relaxed. Yes, I was. Oh, my 13 trailed off as she stepped into the room and finally looked at the girls. And suddenly, 3 of the 4 lovers turned scarlet red with embarrassment and mortification. Izuku tried to cover himself with his hands while looking away. Ochako screamed before pulling the sheets over her head, horrified that her favorite hero saw her like this. Gyro was about to do the same, until she noticed that Hatsum didn't care in the least and even started sitting up, causing the sheets to fall off her. Gyro acted quickly and made sure they were both covered. This isn't what it looks like. Well, actually I guess it is B, but Midoriya didn't force himself on us or take advantage of us, Ochako cried out as she peeked out from under the sheets. 13 just held her hands up. Calm down, Nezu explained the situation, and I know Midoriya well enough to know he would never take advantage of anyone. 13 assuaged them, though she did seem a little uncomfortable as she spied their distended bellies. Hatsum's in particular. They all seemed to calm down a little at that, but still looked bashful as Izuku reached for the towel he used earlier to try and cover himself some more. His eyes lit up a little though, as he realized something. Wait, how did you get past the robots and other students? You can't use your quirk without opening your suit after all, he asked. Oh, yes, that 13 began, a bit of cheer returning to her tone at the distraction from the pregnant girls. I was actually already in the dorm area. I was the one chasing you when you first got here, she explained, much to their shock. Wait, you were here the whole time? Gyro shrieked as her face practically glowed red with embarrassment and horror. She knew full well that she was a loud screamer. There was no way 13 hadn't heard her. For nearly a whole hour, the space hero looked away as she rubbed the back of her neck awkwardly. Yeah, I was trying to get Midoriya's attention so I could help him. But he was so worked up he didn't realize it was me or that I wasn't after him. For that reason I lost track of you while running though this dorm, and couldn't find you until I heard Gyro, 13 explained while refusing to look at any of them. Gyro felt like passing out as she ducked under the sheets, no longer caring if Hatsum was covered or not. 13 then awkwardly rubbed her helmet as if she were rubbing her head. Nezu explained how your quirk might affect the minds of the girls on campus, and I've seen what it's done to the worst cases firsthand, so I decided to give you some privacy. 13 continued, to the mounting mortification of all present. Steam erupted from Izuku's ears as he stood ramrod straight. I am sorry, Sensei. 2 tried Budek. Izuku was cut off by one of Gyro's jacks plugging into his ear. I told you to stop blaming yourself. I was literally contemplating suicide before you, Gyro yelled from under the sheets, but couldn't finish as her words dipped into more intimate topics, and her memories of their first time came flooding back. 13 seemed to grow serious though. So it's not an isolated incident, she muttered, causing everyone to grow concerned. Sensei, Izuku spoke as he got a little more serious himself. 13 was quiet for a moment as she pondered the new information. Like I mentioned before, while collecting the incapacitated males around the school for Recovery Girl, I encountered a student that was about to seriously hurt herself. Not suicide, but a harebrained scheme to lure you out. I managed to stop her, but if it can progress as bad as Gyro says, 13 explained before going quiet for a moment. She then sighed under her helmet. Nezu was right, and you're going to have to deal with them. Midoriya, 13 sounded extremely uncomfortable as she spoke. The idea of sending him out intentionally to knock up the girls around UA didn't sit right with her, but they didn't have a choice in the matter. Her gaze then leveled with Izuku though, and he could tell she was glaring at him. That being said, we can't afford to wait around if the other girls are inevitably going to reach that point, so no more hour-long hokey pokey sessions, at least until this situation is resolved, she scolded Izuku, whose eyes widened before he bowed in apology and embarrassment. It peeved 13 a little that she had to wait that long while listening to Gyro and sometimes the other girls screaming in nirvana. It also made her a little jealous, since her own man couldn't hope to last that long, and with 3 girls no less. But she would never admit that. Now come on. We need to regroup and get these girls to Nezu and Recovery Girl, 13 said, but then froze in place as the sheets finally fell off Hatsum, and the hero turned away. After you get dressed, of course, she blurted out and made her way out of the room and closed the door. 3 of the 4 occupants sighed in relief. Hatsum, of course, was totally unaffected by the situation. After a moment, Izuku began helping the girls get dressed as they continued in awkward silence. Meanwhile, 13 was standing outside, waiting for them to finish. She felt incredibly uncomfortable as the memories of Gyro's screams flashed to the forefront of her mind, and then the images of all 3 girls, heavily pregnant and ready to pop. 13 had dealt with many situations over the years, but never one like this. She was pulled from her thoughts though, by the door finally opening and Izuku stepping out in some of Achako's clothes. A pair of khaki pants and a blue shirt. We're as ready as we can be, Izuku spoke, still feeling ashamed at the situation, and making 13 feel a little guilty. The space hero sighed and placed a hand on his shoulder. It's alright, Midoriya, you did the best you could with the situation you were given. I'm actually surprised you held out as long as you did, she said, trying to cheer him up. It worked a little bit, but the situation was clearly still getting to him, and he refused to make eye contact as he led her inside. Ochako and Gyro were dressed like they were before, but Hatsune was just barely fitting back into her old clothes, her tank top acting more like a bra than a shirt. She apparently had some sort of exoskeleton attached to her legs though, that helped support her weight and move her numb appendages. She still had to prop herself against the bed though. The other girls simply couldn't stand at all though. Okay, let's get a move on, 13 said as she moved over to support Hatsune, while Izuku picked up Gyro and Ochako used her quirk on herself and held onto Izuku's shoulder. But how are we getting out of here? If Hatsune turns off her robots, then the other students will swarm us, Ochako asked. Don't worry, Nezu had some secret tunnels built under the school, in case the teachers needed to evacuate the students. Well used, that she said as she lead them out. Well, keep an eye out for Setsuna. I saw her head while I was floating over the school looking for Deku, and well, I may have punted her head down to the ground, Ochako sheepish admitted as she warned them of the Class B student. Ah, thanks for the heads up, Uraraka. Now we just need to. Boom. 13 was cut off by an explosion from the gates as they stepped outside. Oh no, my beautiful army is trashed, Hatsune lamented, but rebounded immediately as she already started on plans for a better one. Baby harnesses included. This is bad, we can't let any of the affected girls know where the entrance is, 13 warned. Then I'll lead them away and catch up, Izuku spoke without hesitation as he handed Gyro over to 13. Wait, Midori, I can't let 13 froze as a sudden wave of terror washed over her. It was as if a dark miasma was wafting off Izuku as he slowly turned to look at 13 over his shoulder. No one will endanger my children or their mothers, he spoke with a dark tone. It was in that moment that 13 realized she was no longer talking to a student. She was talking to a father-to-be, who was pissed that his girls and their unborn children were not yet someplace safe. A man who had the power to surpass All Might and was tired of feeling powerless. Izuku, Ochako spoke quietly, and Izuku seemed to rein in his temper and smiled up at her. Don't worry, I'll catch up, he promised her as he removed her hand from his shoulder and placed it on 13. But how will you find us, Gyro asked, and Izuku looked thoughtful for a second. He then looked down at his hand and green pads appeared on his fingers. I guess now's as good a time as any to test it out, he muttered before reaching up and caressing Ochako's face. There was a sudden flash of green underneath his fingers and he smiled at her. There, now I can get to you, no matter where you go, he said before suddenly ing Ochako. The girl was stunned and confused, but didn't get the chance to say anything, as Izuku shot off the moment the ended. Come on, we'll have to put our faith in him for now, 13 said as she began escorting the girls away. Meanwhile, Izuku ran through the gate, making sure as many of the mob of general studies and support class students saw him as possible. He was just glad none of the hero class students were here, though it did explain why they hadn't broken through sooner. Izuku couldn't help but curse himself as he ran though. He had given into his desires and the false sense of security Hatsune had given with her bots. Had a hero course student come along, or worse yet, a pro, then things wouldn't have gone so smoothly. He definitely wouldn't have been able to have his hour of bliss with the girls. Izuku shoved his self-loathing down for later. He had more important things to worry about. Izuku ducked, bobbed, weaved and dodged all around the girls as he bounced between the dead robots like a pinball. Not too fast though. He couldn't be untouchable, or else they might end up like Gyro did. He had to stay just out of reach but not beyond capture, and he made sure to memorize each girl's face, in case they did break down. Izuku gritted his teeth as he made sure to make a spectacle out of his movements. He needed to draw attention to himself and away from his pregnant girlfriend and potential girlfriends. And as he did so, he made his way further and further towards the main building. A girl with bird wings tried to dive bomb him, and he jumped to the side. A girl with drills coming out of her hands tried to come up under him, and he jumped up against a tree. Then the tree started to move as another girl made it try and grab him, so he jumped away again. He didn't break anything or use any other quirks. He would not drive these girls to the same level of hopelessness he did Gyro. Izuku was sweating and breathing heavily by the time he reached the entrance of the main building, and he started to see familiar faces start to show up. I guess it's been long enough, he muttered as they all gathered around him, ready to pounce. Don't worry, I'll be back for you girls later, he promised them, hoping it would keep them from having a breakdown when he was gone. Izuku then released a smokescreen to conceal himself, before reaching out his hand and activating the quirk. There was a flash of light within the smoke, but when one of the girls cleared it away, they all cried in despair when they saw Izuku had disappeared. Izuku gasped as he pushed himself up from the ground. A puddle of rainbow vomit at his feet. Ugh, well it worked, Izuku moaned as he braced himself against the wall, head tagged after leaving Ochako. Izuku then grinned as he looked down at the green pads on his fingers. The last of the quirks had given his and Ochako's children. Teleportation. He could now instantly reach any place head tagged, be it Ochako or this wall. He had considered going straight to his girlfriend, but decided to give them some more time to get into whatever tunnels 13 was leading them to. Izuku groaned as his stomach continued to do flips though. This one was easily the most disorienting of the 4 quirks he got from Ochako and their kids. He shook it off though as he manifested Gyro's quirk and plunged into the wall. He was back at the dorms and he needed to make sure the mob wasn't dubbing back. He closed his eyes as he focused but didn't hear any footsteps getting closer. So the girls must have been too frenzied to think about checking back here. He did hear some footsteps in the other direction though. 13 and his girls most likely. He sighed as he didn't hear anyone else near them, but frowned as he picked up another sound. He couldn't identify it. It wasn't like anything he'd ever heard before. It was like a wet, slapping sound, like slugs hitting against the ground. And it was getting closer. Izuku's eyes flew open as he looked down to see several small hunks of flesh moving towards him. Izuku yelped as he hopped back, but the pieces flew up the leg of his shorts. Izuku yelled as he tried to gab at his leg and hold the pants shut. It was then that Ochako's warning came back to him. It's Setsuna, Izuku realized as he struggled to keep his pants sealed shut. Izuku scanned the area as he tried to figure out where the girl was, but saw nothing and he couldn't understand just what she was hoping to accomplish by sending the segmented pieces of her body up his pants. Izuku gasped though as the pieces squirmed past his grip. His eyes then widened as he realized just what part of her body Setsuna had sent up his pants. Holy shit, Izuku screamed, as he was in for a rough day. Crack. The wall next to Izuku crumbled under his grip, his fingers digging in and turning it to rubble as he nearly keeled over while his other hand gripped at his crotch. Izuku's eye twitched in frustration, as anger and pleasure both flashed across his face. A wet spot formed in his pants as the velvety muscles surrounding his erect manhood cliched and squirted in climax. Izuku grunted as the pleasure overwhelmed him but was met with equal amounts of frustration at his inability to climax himself. Damn it, Setsuna, Izuku grunted out as he felt her womanhood, separated from her body, begin moving up and down along his erection again, in spite of his efforts to stop her. This had been going on for a few minuets now and Izuku still hadn't found her. Setsuna had hidden herself well and Izuku couldn't focus. Not with her screwing him remotely while running from other girls. The others constantly getting in the way had actually been the biggest issue in finding Setsuna to finally put an end to this love torture, though Izuku was beginning to somewhat understand what they were going through. That's it, if I have to suffer through this again after finding Setsuna, then him getting a chastity belt once this is all over, Izuku grunted out, as he plugged his ear jacks into the wall in hopes of finding his tormentor. Meanwhile, Setsuna was currently collapsed on the roof of UA, her naked body squirming while she worked her right, B-cup in her hand, her suit laying scattered around her as she writhed. Damn it, why won't he finish GAHH, she yelled as she reached another climax, but still felt unsatisfied, due to the lack of the warm, thick feeling she desperately needed to fill her. Setsuna was beginning to regret her decisions. She had gotten desperate and hadn't thought her plan through. All she wanted was to just get the important part of her down there and get some quick relief. She did not get what she sought though. What am I missing, she muttered between whimpers and moans as she clenched her serrated teeth, and began to wonder if she should just let Izuku know where she was and pray he would finally give her some relief. Boom. Setsuna was broken from her thoughts by something landing on the roof with her and creating a dust cloud. She coughed a little as the dust cleared and when she looked back up, she was amazed to see Izuku standing there. Any thoughts of hope or desperation were forgotten though, as Izuku looked down at her with a dark look in his eye, and Setsuna actually felt a smidgen of fear. Setsuna, he spoke quietly. Before she could act though, Izuku suddenly shot forwards with incredible speed, grabbing her and pinning her to the wall of the stairway entrance. This has to end now, Izuku yelled as he gripped her tightly by the arms and brought his mouth down on her left nipple. Setsuna whimpered as she clawed at the wall behind her while Izuku held her in place. Oh yes, I'm sorry, Izuku, I'm sorry I didn't come to you sooner, Setsuna moaned as she finally started to feel something other than constant frustration at Izuku's inability to finish. Even as she felt pleasure overwhelming her, Setsuna focused on her womanhood inside Izuku's pants and kept it moving up and down his length at a fast pace. Even as she gasped in surprise and pleasure when milk started spraying out of her ass and Izuku ravenously sucked them, she kept the pace going. Oh yes, ravish me, Midoriya, am all yours, Setsuna cried out as she reached another orgasm. Izuku grunted in pleasure and frustration. He had gotten what he needed. He knew how her quirk worked, so why couldn't he finish? Izuku felt like he was about to have an aneurysm if he didn't achieve relief soon, and it clouded his thought processes a little, as he felt Setsuna's womanhood drive down on him as far as it could go, but couldn't take him fully as he hit the end. Izuku's eyes widened as he realized what he was missing and he released Setsuna so he could yank his pants down. Setsuna was surprised by the sudden action and paused in her remote pounding of him, as Izuku thrust forward into the empty space where her entrance should be. They both grunted in frustration and discomfort though, as Izuku hit against her empty space a few times with no success and Izuku stopped to look down. Oh, it's the other way, he muttered before grabbing Setsuna and flipping her around. The lizard girl yelped as she was forced against the wall, and this time, when Izuku thrust forwards, her womanhood rejoined with her main body and he was able to go deeper. Setsuna cried out as Izuku penetrated her womb and began thrusting without mercy, causing her eyes to roll back in her head and her long tongue to hang out. She was shocked back to her senses by a sudden flash of heat though. She was interrupted by a pent-up Izuku, grunting and smashing her flat against the wall as he thrust in deep. Smash. Izuku yelled as he finally came hard. Setsuna throwing her head back and crying out as she finally felt that satisfying, molten heat in her deepest place. Izuku breathed heavily as he leaned against Setsuna, sandwiching her between him and the wall as she shook in place and squirted all over the roof and wall she was pressed against. As the moment stretched on, Setsuna blinked back to life and her eyes widened, as the haze of Izuku's quirk lifted and she was horrified by what she'd done to Izuku. She wasn't angry at Izuku. It was pretty easy to tell by how hard he ran away from everyone that this wasn't intentional on his part, but rather she was horrified by herself. She had essentially used her quirk to try and rape Izuku. Even if it wasn't entirely her fault, the idea to get Izuku like that had been hers alone. Setsuna felt like crying as she clenched her fist against the wall and felt Izuku's warm body pressed against her back. She didn't know him as well as some of the others, but she knew enough to understand Izuku wasn't the type to take advantage of a situation like this unless forced to or influenced in some way. He probably hates me now, Setsuna thought as she tried to glance over her shoulder at Izuku. Gosh, she suddenly yelped as she felt Izuku thrust back into her hard, as he gripped her arms. Izuku, she stuttered as she looked over her shoulder again and was shocked and terrified to see Izuku's eyes still glazed over with hunger and frustration. A half-remembered quote suddenly came to Setsuna. All men fear three things: the dark, the sea during a storm, and the rage of a gentle man. Setsuna realized in that moment that she had driven Izuku to nearly the same level of desperation the girls were feeling with her stunt. His previous experience with Hatsune, mounting along with his quirk's influence, causing Izuku's mind to go blank while instinct took over. And Setsuna cried out as Izuku began railing her again, smashing her into the wall, hard and fast as one for all, arced across his body. Setsuna yelled and moaned before whimpering, as Izuku grabbed her left shoulder to hold her down, while his right hand gripped her hip tightly. Setsuna threw her head back and cried out in pleasure before shaking her head. No, focus, Setsuna, you have to snap him out of it even if it does feel so damn good, she thought as she fought to keep her eyes from rolling back in her head. She then detached her head and moved it to look at Izuku. Midoriya Uwa, calm down, I am sorry, she tried to speak, even as it felt like Izuku would drive her mad with pleasure. Setsuna gasped though, as Izuku's crazed and hungry eyes locked with hers, and suddenly he reached out and touched the back of her head, while his other hand detached from his body, just like hers could, and touched the ground. Setsuna yelped as her head was pulled to the ground and she found herself stuck there. She was stunned into silence though, as Izuku reattached his hand, then moved Setsuna's body so she was leaning over her own head, forcing her to stare up at herself as he held her by the arms and thrust into her with one for all, while also moving both his ear jack down to vibrate harshly against his sensitive spot. Setsuna screamed as she climaxed. Holy shit, this is it, Setsuna thought with a mind clouded by pleasure, as she watched Izuku's manhood disappear into her as her bounced and leaked from the heavy impacts. It's amazing, she moaned out as she gave into the bliss she felt, and Izuku roared in satisfaction as he continued to thrust viciously. Izuku pounded her for a little longer, before he finally thrust in deep and released again, and Setsuna moaned, but then her eyes nearly bugged out, as she watched her belly expanding until it was undeniable that she was heavily pregnant, and ready to pop at any moment. Setsuna screamed, as she orgasmed from the sight as well as the feel of Izuku's manhood deep inside her, while his jacks vibrated against her bud, and Izuku moaned in relief before letting them fall away. Izuku then stumbled back and leaned against the wall as he recovered. He was still holding Setsuna's body, but was now gently hugging her instead, as his mind began to clear. A moment passed as Setsuna and Izuku both panted and gazed at nothing with glazed eyes. Eventually, Izuku took a breath and shook his head as he came back to his senses and looked around. He then noticed Setsuna's headless body in his arms and yelped as he nearly dropped her, but quickly pulled her close again before she could fall, due to her numb legs, and looked around for her head. Setsuna, he squeaked out, before hearing a moan from the ground. Down here, she spoke in a bit of a daze, and Izuku looked down at her head. It was then that it all came back to Izuku and his face fell in shame at how he lost control. One thought passed through his mind as he took in the scene that had played out and Setsuna's large belly. Well shit. Crisis fatigue. A condition that occurs when an individual is subjected to stressful situations repeatedly, and often, until they become accustomed to them. Izuku wasn't yet fully at that stage, but he was beginning to show the signs as he leaned against the wall with Setsuna's body in his arms. He still felt ashamed that he'd lost control like he did, but he wasn't about to break down like before with gyro ether. Setsuna, I'm so sorry too, don't know what came over me, he apologized, but Setsuna just chuckled weakly. Hey, I brought this on myself even if I wasn't in my right mind at the time, she said as she blinked some of the haze from her eyes and looked up at Izuku. I guess neither of us was thinking straight also. Can you let go of my head now, she said, and Izuku just stared at her for a moment. In the end, Izuku just sighed and slid down the wall, as if defeated, and brought Setsuna with him so she was sitting in his lap. With her body no longer in danger of falling over, Izuku loosened his grip as she leaned back on him and he pressed his fingers together. Setsuna sighed as her head was free to float back up and reattach to her body, and she continued to lean back into Izuku. Izuku let the girl take her time but still made sure to keep his hands off her though, not knowing what she would be okay with. Setsuna took a moment to breathe as she processed everything. Then she finally looked down at her distended belly and hesitated before placing a hand on it. Setsuna was quiet, as she didn't know what to think of all this, until she felt movement from inside and a tiny, hand-shaped bulge under her own hand. She then gave a breathless laugh and shook her head. "Damn it, how can I already be so attached to you?" she muttered as she leaned her head back next to Izuku's. She then looked over to see the look of uncertainty on his face, as he let her come to terms with everything. "Okay, Illbite, how did this happen and why can you suddenly use my quirk?" she asked as she rubbed her belly, where her baby's hand was pressing against hers. The situation did freak her out more than a little, but she wouldn't go crazy until she heard what Izuku had to say. The green-haired hero sighed and looked away from her as he grew uncomfortable. "How do I explain it?" he muttered, before glancing back at Setsuna. "My doctors lied about my quirk and now it's cased all of this and it copies the quirks of the girls I impregnate. And the quirks of our kids," Izuku explained the best he could. Setsuna was quiet for a moment as she took in the information. "Well, that's it up overpowered, but it up," she said bluntly. Her emotions stretched too thin by the situation and the undeniable reality of her pregnancy to care about crass language at the moment. "Well, it sounds like it wasn't my fault." "Yes, I know," Izuku suddenly snapped as he covered his face with his right hand. Setsuna looked at him with surprise but then he just looked guilty again. "I'm sorry, it's just everyone's been saying it's not my fault and objectively I know it but I just can't stop thinking it still feels like it's my responsibility," Izuku explained as his face fell, looking defeated. Setsuna blinked at Izuku before giving a gentle but exhausted smile. "Yeah, you are responsible. It's not your fault, but you still have to take care of us. Which is what you did for me and those other girls I saw you with. When you stopped that torture we were stuck in." Setsuna spoke and was happy to see the teary-eyed Izuku look at her as she grinned. "So, you are planning on supporting us, right?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Of course, Izuku immediately spoke without hesitation and his depression washed away, if only briefly. Setsuna just grinned at him. "Good, then you've done all you can to make up for it already," she spoke as she leaned her head back and looked to the sky while resting her hands on her belly. "Damn it, this situation is so messed up, but I can't bring myself to hate you or not love these kids you put in me already," she said as she relished the little kick she felt against her hand. "Wow, my parents are gonna lose it when they find out," she thought aloud as she still worked to come to terms with what was happening to her. She did feel a little guilty though, when she felt Izuku flinch at the mention of her parents and Izuku's face turned pale with dread at the thought of so many angry fathers chasing after him with intent to kill. Then he thought of his own mother and her reaction to all this and his face burned with embarrassment and dread. He was pulled back to reality by a light jab to his side from Setsuna's elbow. "Come on, don't get all depressed on me. I'm actually still freaking out inside a little, but we need to get out of here before anyone else shows up. We can deal with our issues later," she said before trying to get up, only to give an exhausted groan as her legs gave out on her. Setsuna frowned at her legs, then her belly as she pondered just how safe it would be for the babies if she used her quirk to move. Before she could do anything though, Izuku suddenly stood up with her in his arms and she yelped as she clung to him. "Ook, this works too, but can I get some clothes on first before we leave?" she said with a blush as she looked away. Izuku pondered her question for a moment, before he brought out his jacks and plugged one into the wall. He then pondered for a moment longer, before separating his right eye from his head while closing his left. He became a little nauseous, causing his eye to wobble in place, before he adjusted and unsteady moved it up to look around. At the same time, the crosshairs from Hatsume's quirk appeared in his eye, as he used zoom. Setsuna was honestly a little scared and amazed by the fact that Izuku was using 3 quirks simultaneously, with little to no practice, though he was obliviously struggling to maintain focus. Izuku grunted after a moment and retracted all of his quirks, as he wobbled on his feet a little while his face turned green, but he held it down. "We have a few minutes before they get here, but that's if someone doesn't have a quirk that lets them get up here faster," Izuku explained with a weak voice as he tried to keep from vomiting again. He then set Setsuna's feet on the ground while still holding her up with one hand, and reached over with the other to grip the metal door and warp the metal with sheer strength, to prevent it from opening. Setsuna blinked and suddenly felt genuine arousal as she looked away with a blush. "Wow, you're such a cinnamon roll that I forget you can just casually bend metal without even using your quirk," she said with a voice of nervousness and arousal, as she became acutely aware of the very strong and rippling muscles that were holding her up and the rock-hard abs and chest she was leaning against. Izuku blushed and looked away, as he walked Setsuna over to her discarded clothes. The lizard girl groaned in frustration though, as she struggled to work around her protruding belly. Dang it, just how many kids did you put in me, she muttered offhandedly, to which Izuku fidgeted uncomfortably. F4, you're carrying quadruplets though, I'm pretty sure the only reason you don't have more is because I finished so soon after putting you back together, he muttered while avoiding eye contact. Setsuna screeched to a halt though as her head snapped to Izuku's. Whoa, wait a minute, how do you know that, she asked while placing a hand on her belly as if she were trying to count them while Izuku sputtered a little. It's my quirk, I can tell how many kids I impregnate girls with along with the genders, Izuku explained, but then suddenly grew contemplative as he lowered Setsuna to the ground so she could start putting on parts of her clothes that would fit. Although, I only made 3 quirks, so maybe 2 of them will be identical, because I didn't let any of them be quirkless, he muttered while rubbing his chin. Whoa, rewind, what was that part about making quirks, Setsuna suddenly exclaimed while pausing and putting on the pants part of her suit. She couldn't fit it all on, so she had to separate the suit like she did with her quirk. When she saw Izuku sputtering though, she shook her head with a groan. No, never mind, you can explain later. For now let's just focus on getting someplace safe, Setsuna sighed as she separated the belly part of her suit from the top and slipped it on, while only grimacing a little as her slightly larger bust strained against her suit. Okay, I'm as ready as I'll ever be. So how do we get out of here, she asked, and Izuku picked her back up while thinking hard. He then looked over the side of the building to see if anyone was looking and gave a nod. Alright, I'm going to have to move fast once we start. Are you ready, he asked, and Setsuna nodded while Izuku gave her a reassuring smile. He then let a little bit of one for all flow through him as he looked forwards and jumped while using float, causing him to gently glide from one roof of the school to the other. Once he touched down, he immediately started running. Not as fast as he would have liked, but he wasn't going to risk anything with his kids. He made his way down the staircase to the level he desired and made a break for it, running and dodging any occupied hallways. His sense of smell and Gyro's quirk proving invaluable to avoiding and hiding from the few students in this part of the school. This continued for a while, until they came up on a set of heavy doors, designed to tank the biggest explosions imaginable. We're here, the support department, Izuku said from the doorway of another classroom, down the hall. He didn't see anyone, but he knew they were on this floor. You're sure recovery girl's in there with the others, Setsuna asked, and Izuku nodded, before setting her on the floor and leaning her against the teacher's desk. I'll go get them to open the door and be right back, he promised with a confident smile that she knew didn't match his inner turmoil, with everything that was happening. But it still eased her worries as he placed a hand on her shoulder, then a more hesitant one on her belly. She knew Izuku would be back and gave a grateful smile of her own. Izuku nodded to her as he stood up and made sure the door was locked. Izuku, Setsuna called out before he could leave, but looked away with a nervous blush as he turned his attention to her. You said you knew what the genders were, but never actually told me, she said quietly while rubbing her belly. Izuku was quiet for a moment before smiling at her. 2 boys and 2 girls, and the girls are the identical ones, he explained, and several emotions flashed across Setsuna's face before she smiled down at her belly. Thanks, Midoriya, she muttered as he smiled at her. I'll be back soon, he promised again, as he held his hand out in the direction of the support department, and vanished in a flash of green, leaving Setsuna to her own thoughts as she sighed and looked down at her pregnant belly. Meanwhile, Izuku reappeared and fought the urge to vomit but managed to succeed this time. Ugh, that's going to take some getting used to, he muttered as he waited for his stomach to settle. Deku, Ochako suddenly spoke, and Izuku's eyes rose to meet hers, as his hand continued to caress her cheek where head touched her before. It was then that his face turned red as he realized the position head landed in, practically laying on Ochako, who was laying half-naked on a gurney, like would be found in a hospital. Whack! Oh, Izuku yelped as he was knocked off Ochako by a swift knock to the head, and fell to the floor of the repurposed support department. None of that, you've done enough already, a fuming reconvey girl yelled as she stood over him with her cane ready to strike again. Now, recovery girl. We already discussed this. Not only did we already consider this outcome, but given the girls' description of their experience, it is for the best, Nezu interrupted the angry doctor, giving Izuku the chance to look around and see all the girls laying on freshly fabricated gurneys, waiting to be examined by recovery girl. That still doesn't excuse, the elderly woman started as she swung again, but immediately fell silent as Izuku caught it, and there was a look in his eye she hadn't seen in him before, one that dared her to get in his way and promised pain if she tried. I'm sorry, recovery girl. Any other time I'd let you whack me over the head as much as I deserve. But I have more important things to take care of, Izuku spoke flatly as he stood up and towered over the woman. Nezu, I need you to open the door, he said simply but respectfully, and Nezu hit the switch without question. Izuku ran out of the room so fast it looked like he vanished, leaving a stunned recovery girl and smirking Nezu. I thought this might happen, the principal muttered as he walked over to her. The gentlest souls are often the most fierce when something or someone they care for is at stake, especially when that something is fatherhood, he explained to the still stunned hero, who was seeing a new side to the boy who she'd gotten to know over the years. Izuku then ran back in at a slower pace, with Setsuna in his arms, and closed the door. Izuku then walked the blushing girl over to a free gurney while Gyro and Ochako smiled and waved awkwardly at her. Hatsum just grinned without a hint of shame. Recovery Girl had to fight down the knee-jerk reaction to hit and chew out the boy for knocking up yet another girl in so short a time. She had grown used to the dynamic they had, which was similar to the one she shared with All Might, and it was both jarring and terrifying to be forced to remember that Izuku could level the building with her in it if he was ever pushed too hard while in such a fragile mental state. Recovery Girl sighed as she reminded herself that Izuku was just as much a victim, and moved to examine her new patient. "I'll take care of the girls you talk with, Nezu," she instructed, and was relieved to see Izuku relax a little as he saw them all safe. "Thank you," he said as he gave a reassuring squeeze to Setsuna's arm, then greeted the other girls before walking over to the principal. "Nezu, wait, where's 13?" Izuku asked as he moved with Nezu into what he assumed was Power Loader's office, and collapsed onto a worn-out and grease-stained couch, while Nezu took the chair across from him. "She's out collecting the incapacitated males on campus and taking them to safe areas until they awaken, while also keeping an eye out for any students or faculty about to do anything drastic," Nezu explained, and Izuku nodded in understanding while stealing glances at the door leading to the makeshift maternity ward. "I suppose I should say you have nothing to worry about with Recovery Girl watching over them, but we both know you will anyway," Nezu said with a comforting smile. Izuku sighed as he buried his face in his hands. "I have 4 pregnant girls I need to support, and am going to be a father of 17 soon. Maybe even in the next few seconds for all I know," Izuku lamented as he allowed himself to vent. The classic Midoriya tears threatening to break free and strip the paint from the walls, as he finally had some time to think in actual safety without the distraction of 3 beautiful and enticing girls demanding his affections. Nezu just waited patiently as he picked up a cup of tea and started sipping it. "Please tell me you have some good news," Izuku practically begged as he looked to Nezu, only to blink in surprise when he realized he was holding a cup of tea. "How did?" he muttered before shaking his head, deciding not to question it while Nezu chuckled. "Well, we have good news and bad news. Which would you like to hear first?" he asked, and Izuku took a moment before sighing and he took a big gulp of his tea, hoping it would help calm his nerves. "Normally I'd say give me the bad news first, but with how crazy everything is now, maybe the good news will soften the blow," he said, and Nezu nodded. "Well, the good news is, the girls won't be going into labor anytime soon. According to Recovery Girl and her examination, while the children are fully developed and ready, your quirk seems to factor in the stress this will have on the mothers, and is giving them time to adjust and prepare. If Recovery Girl is correct, they will give birth sometime after the first 12 to 24 hours," Nezu explained, and Izuku nearly collapsed with relief. It wasn't much, but they at least had a day to prepare, and it wasn't going to happen while this disaster was still going on. "Thank God, we have time, plus I would hate myself if I wasn't with them when it happened," Izuku thought as he let out a sigh. He then remembered the bad news though and sat up to focus on Nezu, whose face lost a little of its usual cheer. "Earlier, we captured one of the girls and attempted to sedate them in the hopes that they wouldn't suffer the negative effects of your quirk while unconscious," Nezu began, but then grimaced, which set off alarm bells in Izuku's head. Unfortunately, the plan backfired horribly. It would appear she was plagued by an erotic dream that only proved to be more torturous for her, since it wasn't really you, and she then woke up in a frenzied state and escaped after tearing apart the nurse's office, Nezu explained while shivering at the memory. "So, you may want to keep an eye out for an especially ravenous woman hunting for you," he finished with a smile to hide his grimace. Bang! Izuku slammed his face into the stained and junk-littered metal table between them, his left hand attempting to claw into it while the other trembled while trying not to break the teacup clutched in his fingers. "Please tell me you have a cure," Izuku spoke with a muffled and distressed voice, but Nezu just gave an apologetic smile. "Sorry, Midoriya, but unfortunately all our attempts have ended in failure, or backfired spectacularly. Your quirk is just too powerful with one for all. So far the only way to end the effects is for you to satisfy them," Nezu explained and held no hard feelings when the teacup's handle shattered in Izuku's fingers. Izuku then sat up while taking a deep breath. "Is there any more bad news?" he asked with dread, and Nezu was very glad he couldn't sweat. "No, I believe that's it," he lied. Though in his defense, it was actually part of the first bit of bad news and he would tell Izuku after Head had time to calm down. "But while we're on the subject, I believe the girls mentioned you discovered more about your quirk, but Recovery Girl was more focused on their current health. Any new information is worth its weight in gold," though Nezu began the careful process of both gathering useful information and distracting Izuku from his current stress, and was satisfied to see him perk up a little as he pulled a notebook from somewhere. Minutes passed as Izuku quickly explained what had leaned of his quirk so far. His excitement over analyzing and explaining his quirk, as well as the quirks had made, overriding his shame and guilt at the situation. Nezu, unexpectedly, was growing excited himself, as his hyper-intelligent mind processed just how overpowered Cultivator made Izuku and how much more powerful he could become. After the discussion had moved past One for All's involvement, they had moved the discussion out with the others, so they could be privy to the parts regarding them and their unborn children, and to ease Izuku's anxiety at being separated from them and unable to provide support. Everyone else, while not as far-seeing as Nezu, understood the implications of Izuku's quirk, and Recovery Girl in particular was sweating a little. The similarities between Cultivator and All for One, a little too uncanny for her comfort, Had it been anyone else who got this quirk, she would be terrified beyond belief. Nezu hummed though, as his mind worked in overdrive. Midoriya, if you don't mind my saying, but I can't help but notice all the quirks you've created. All resemble or share aspects of the girls you impregnate. Is that a limitation of your quirk, or something else, he asked, and Izuku blushed at the reminder of his quirk's nature. Well, I wouldn't say it's a limitation per se, he started, but paused as he pondered how to explain. I guess the best way to describe it is like having bunch on random model kit parts scattered in front of me, each one a different color, size or shape for each gene or chromosome. Except each part is coated in superglue, so I can't take anything back once I've snapped them together, Izuku tried to explain, and Nezu nodded along. So basically you can't use trial and error to figure out the combinations. Not without risk of creating an unsavory result, Nezu summarized for everyone, and Izuku nodded along. Yes, exactly. But when I copy their quirk, it's like getting the instruction manual. Now I know how each part can fit together for that particular build, and I can safely tweak it, Izuku continued as he and Nezu both seemed to become more excited. And the more instruction manuals you get, the better you get at kit bashing the different genes together, even if it's a set you haven't worked with before, Nezu speculated further as Izuku nodded his head. Exactly, but I still have to work with the parts I'm given. I can try and make something totally different, but there's a chance it might not work or will mutate into something else. So I try to stick close to the original specs, Izuku explained further as the two brainiacs in the room continued their excited conversation. Meanwhile, the girls in the room sweat dropped as they watched. Did he just refer to us as model kits? Gyro asked tensely. Her jacks vibrated dangerously as she debated whether to jab her lover in the ear for his method of describing her, or laugh at his cute, quirky personality. The others laughed weakly at her question, and Gyro sighed as she let her jacks fall. She just couldn't bring herself to kill the mood. Not when Izuku was smiling like that for the first time since this all started. She didn't count the time after their hour of passion together. That was more like relief and acceptance of the situation and of their feelings for him. Ochako seemed to share the sentiment from where she lay, while Hatsune seemed to actually enjoy being compared to a mecha as she listened attentively to Izuku and Nezu's ramblings. The two were interrupted by a blast of static over a handheld radio on the nearby workbench. Hey boss, I hate to interrupt, but things are starting to get hairy out here. Please tell me you got a plan ready to deal with this, a voice spoke through the static. Snipe, Izuku blurted with surprise. But how is he still awake? Oh, that's right. He has a gas mask, Ochako said with some relief that yet another teacher was on their side. Nezu nodded as he made his way over to the radio. Yes, Snipe has been dealing with the woman I mentioned earlier, to make sure nothing bad happens, Nezu explained before giving a sigh as he picked up the radio. That being said, it would appear your time of rest is over, Mr. Midoriya. It's time for you to get back out there and take care of things before anyone hurts themselves, he continued as he turned to Izuku. The boy tensed up as he was reminded what he needed to do, and his face burned red while the others averted their eyes from embarrassment, with the exception of Hatsune. Alright, I guess I need to get out there, Izuku stuttered as he tried to figure out who he should go after first, but then his eyes widened, as he remembered a very important detail that Nezu neglected to mention. Nezu, who was it that you tried to knock out? He asked and grew more nervous as Nezu looked away with a guilty expression. Nezu, who was it? Izuku asked with mounting fear that only skyrocketed when Nezu finally told him who it was. You gotta be kidding me.